On the evening of Friday, April 20th, 2012, the Celis family had a very pleasant time. Rebecca and Sergio's two sons played a baseball game in which their 6-year-old sister, young Isabelle, was present. The game lasted until 10 o'clock, after which the family returned home. The next morning, the girl was supposed to play baseball and Rebecca braided her hair so as not to waste time before work. At 11 o'clock, Sergio wished his daughter good night and left. Although Isabelle had her own bedroom, she often slept in her brother's room. But on this particular night, she stayed alone. Soon, Becky and the boys went to sleep, and Sergio fell asleep on the couch, watching a baseball game he had recorded earlier. At 5 o'clock, the man woke up and slowly made his way to the bedroom. The house was quiet and peaceful when he went to sleep next to his wife. 2 hours later, Rebecca left for work at the medical center. The woman didn't notice anything strange in the house and didn't hear anything. She didn't go into her daughter's room before leaving for work. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, Sergio went to wake his daughter up to go to the game, but Isabelle was not in her bed. He asked his sons if they had seen their sister, but nobody responded. Together with the boys, he searched the house and called for Isabelle, but there was no answer. Then, Sergio Jr., who was 14 years old at the time, noticed that the window in his sister's room was wide open and the protective screen was lying on the ground in the yard. The husband called his wife. While Rebecca was racing home and the sons were frantically searching the neighborhood for their younger sister, Sergio called the rescue service. This was the call that later sparked a lot of controversy and criticism towards him. People react differently in a state of stress or panic, but Sergio was surprisingly calm and collected during the call. Besides his calmness, it seemed strange to many that he immediately stated that his daughter had been kidnapped. He even laughed when he mentioned telling his wife to come home. Later, Sergio explained that he was simply trying to remain calm to provide the police with all the information they needed. Interestingly, the neighbor also called 911 on behalf of Sergio Jr. Unlike his father, he was shaking and clearly upset, but he also immediately stated that his sister had been kidnapped and they wouldn't find her. Then the phone was handed over to Rebecca, who had also been in a panic and despair when she arrived home. She was able to give a precise description of the clothing that her daughter was wearing before her disappearance. The arriving officers indeed found a protective screen on the bedroom window of the girl on the ground in the yard. There was a large hole in it, as if someone had used a tool to make it. Soft toys were always lying under the girl's window in the room, and now they were scattered in disorder. Blood was discovered on the floor next to Isabelle. Shoe prints were found behind the house, on the alley and on the electrical box under the high fence of the family. Presumably, the perpetrator climbed over it when he abducted the girl. The police organized massive searches, going from door to door, believing it was a kidnapping case, rejecting the idea that the 6-year-old girl could have run away. The neighbor of the Celis family, Alicia Stardivant, said that she was woken up by a noise around 6:30 a.m. Her bedroom is literally across the fence from the girl's room. The girl said that she heard her dogs and the Celis family dogs barking. Besides them, she heard men's voices, seemingly on her side of the fence, not at the Celis family's home. But it was already getting light outside, and she didn't pay attention to it and fell asleep again. Alicia noted that the men did not lower their voices or whisper, and she didn't think for a second that there was also a small child there. The police set up a checkpoint around the Celis family's house and only allowed local residents through. The search initially focused on a small area around the house because in most cases, children are killed within a radius of 100 meters from the place of abduction. Then they expanded the search radius, included several apartment buildings, and interviewed residents. Officers checked the stadium where Isabelle's baseball game was supposed to take place, the local garbage dump. The lakes and ponds were inspected with underwater cameras and sonars. Forensic experts and search dogs searched the Celis family's home, and border guards distributed photos of Isabelle because when children go missing in Arizona, there is a high chance they end up on the other side of the border with Mexico. In addition, in 2012, 16 criminals who had committed violent acts against women and children lived near the family's home. All of them were interrogated and excluded at that time. A theory emerged that someone had noticed Isabelle playing with her brothers in the evening, followed the family, and abducted the girl from the house at night. Following this lead, officers checked the registration numbers of all the cars in the parking lot. Surveillance video cameras located near the family's home showed an unusually active nightlife. At 2:36 a.m., a private security company's car appeared in the alley near the house, and 2 more cars were shown in the parking lot 10 minutes later. Suddenly, a large number of pedestrians were wandering around the house, some of them interested in garbage cans, and an hour before the 911 call, a car quickly turned the corner near the trash can. But the girl did not appear anywhere in the 10 hours of filming. However, something interesting was discovered during the search of the house by the police. The officers found inscriptions on the door frame of Isabelle's wardrobe. The inscriptions were written in a child's handwriting and included such words as bad father, I don't love father, and bad day. Rebecca claimed she had no idea about this, but the police decided to interrogate Isabelle's family more thoroughly. One of the sons revealed that when their father drank, he became aggressive, cursed, and hit him twice. Therefore, investigators invited employees of the Child Protection Services concerned about the Celis sons, especially since, as it turned out, Child Protection Services had been called to the family's home more than once. In January 2012, one of the boys was washing dishes and left a glass in the detergent. Sergio drank water from that glass and scolded his son for his mistake. Rebecca insists that they laughed about the incident. But the next day, the boy told his friends about it, and someone's parents contacted the Child Protection Services. Anyway, in May 2012, at their request, Sergio voluntarily left the house, although Rebecca claimed that her husband was an excellent father and when Isabelle returned home, all questions would be answered. Although the incident was soon resolved and Sergio was able to return home to his wife and sons, the family was upset that the investigation did not bring any results. Although the incident was soon resolved and Sergio was able to return home to his wife and children, the family was upset that the police continued to focus on them, especially Sergio, despite never being named a suspect. Later, the man stated, "It feels like the investigation never went beyond this house. That's what's so upsetting." So they hired private detective Jerry Snyder to conduct an unbiased investigation into Isabelle's abduction. And his suspicions fell on Rebecca's cousin, Justin Mastromarino. At first, Justin acted as a representative of the family, constantly speaking to journalists and giving interviews. But within 2 weeks of Isabelle's disappearance, he sent his car to Florida, hired the best lawyer, and left, refusing to answer reporters or police's questions. Such behavior seemed strange to the private detective. Moreover, Justin had lived in the Celis family's home for a long time and still had a key to the house. There was a version that Justin, who had previously stayed overnight in Isabelle's room, could owe money to someone and the criminal came for him. But instead of Justin, he found Isabelle in the room and took her for ransom or as leverage. On the other hand, his friend Sebastian Hartsfield is confident that Mastromarino did the right thing, and if he had the means, he would have left too. The thing is, Justin was tired of the intrusive attention of the media and the public. Sebastian said that they spent the evening of the abduction together with Justin. He reluctantly admits that it was April 20th, National Cannabis Day, so he and Justin smoked and drank all evening. Although there was a 6-hour gap when they were asleep, and he cannot say for sure where Justin was, Sebastian is confident in his friend's innocence. When the police finally questioned Justin, the police chief said that the investigator hired by the family had no evidence, but the police were absolutely sure of Justin's innocence. It is worth noting that Sergio was also suspected of owing money to bad people, and his daughter was kidnapped for ransom. Isabelle was at the age when children are more often abducted by relatives. She was kidnapped from the house where only her relatives were present, and Sergio was the last person to see her, kissing her goodnight at 11 o'clock. He did not pass a polygraph test. Moreover, the fact that the dogs barked at night indirectly confirms the involvement of someone from the family. How could a stranger know where the girl's room was, that she wouldn't be sleeping in her brother's bedroom, and that there would be no dogs in her room? Usually, at least one of them slept in her bedroom. How could the kidnapper know exactly how to avoid the surveillance cameras located on the street? Yet, besides suspicion, there was nothing linking Sergio or Justin to the crime. Where was Isabelle? Let's go back to the morning of July 23, 2012, when the rescue service received 3 distress calls. A child, a girl, called and said she wanted to report a kidnapping. She mentioned Isabelle's name and said he's coming, identified the district where she was located, and then the call disconnected. The officers went to the specified district, but they didn't find anyone. They traced the call to an apartment building where 2 sisters, aged 9 and 11, lived. The sisters had simply decided to play a prank. The calls caused a lot of fuss, but they were quickly released. However, their joke cost the city $4,700 in officers' wages spent on the search in the district specified by the girls. After this incident, the police tried several times to draw attention to the case, for example, by sharing an image of what Isabelle might look like several years later. But despite all efforts, there was no progress in the case for years. Who kidnapped Isabelle? Was it someone unknown to the family who entered through a window and took her? Did Justin consider kidnapping Isabelle because he was in debt and wanted to demand a ransom, but the kidnapping went wrong? Was one of her brothers involved in what happened to her, and are their relatives covering it up? Or does Isabelle's biological father know more than he's saying? Unexpectedly, on February 8, 2017, there was a breakthrough in the case. A woman named Melissa contacted the FBI and stated that they should speak to her fiancé, Christopher Clements, about the disappearance of Isabelle. Supposedly, he might know something about the girl's disappearance, but Melissa couldn't say anything more and they should talk to him. Finding Christopher proved to be quite easy. He was in jail on charges of robbery. Christopher confirmed to the agents that he knew where to find Isabelle, but demanded a deal. In exchange for information about Isabelle's whereabouts, he wants his charges dropped, his confiscated Acura Honda returned, and full immunity in Isabelle's case. He assured them that he only knows what happened to the girl. It is also known to a member of the Celis family. He hinted that Sergio knew about the kidnapping of his daughter and was involved in it. Christopher told them that Sergio was seen handing over Mexican gold coins to someone at a local pawn shop. Supposedly, there was a fight and Isabelle was taken to get the money that her father owed for the stolen coins. Christopher spoke very broadly, and no matter how much the agents questioned him, he didn't go into details. The man stood his ground, information in exchange for a deal. He got what he wanted. The prosecutor's office went for a deal, dropped the charges of robbery and returned the car. The man revealed where to find Isabelle, and on March 3, 2017, the police and the FBI found her remains. Rebecca and Sergio Celis faced the grim confirmation that Isabelle had left forever. Whatever dreams they had of a happy reunion were destroyed. However, the deal did not give Christopher Clements the desired freedom. Instead, he was transferred to the Maricopa County Jail, where he was charged with another robbery. The agreement did not provide full immunity, which Christopher insisted on in Isabelle's case. Investigators began digging deeper into the man's past. He started his criminal career at the age of 16 by committing first-degree violence. Since then, he had repeatedly gotten into trouble. The man's ex-wife said that Christopher was obsessed with adult movies, often brought girls from strip clubs home, and she was forced to sleep in the car until they left. And at the time of Isabelle's disappearance, He worked at a shopping center only 2 kilometers away from her home. Undoubtedly, detectives checked Sergio's connection to the nearby pawn shop mentioned by Christopher. They found out that 21 gold coins were stolen from the woman's house 2 months before Isabelle's abduction, and they believed that Christopher committed the theft. The surveillance camera captured him entering the pawn shop hours after the theft, delivering the goods, and receiving the money. The video did not suggest Sergio's involvement or any connection to the case. Most likely, Christopher was just studying the accusations against Sergio, which were mentioned in the press, and was talking to agents, trying to cast a shadow on the girl's father. The police received several search warrants, including one for the house where Christopher and his fiancée Melissa used to live. In one corner of the yard, investigators found a sheet of plywood under which was a plastic container containing ashes and several gruesome discoveries, including a faded lilac child's hoodie with a hood and a school assignment of a very young child with the name Mercedes on it. Her full name was Isabelle Mercedes Celis. They also found indecent photos of girls aged 3 to 13 on Christopher's devices. Searches on his computer included Isabelle Celis, unsolved cases in Arizona, and child killer acquitted. A former acquaintance of Christopher's said he talked about the Isabelle case and let slip that there might be evidence in the trunk of his car, so it was crucial to bring it back. The car was described as a Honda Acura that was returned to the man in exchange for information about Isabelle's whereabouts. It is still unknown how Isabelle died, but according to the same acquaintance, she was suffocated and her body was doused with chemicals. The man remembered that Christopher showed him photos of the Celis house that he had hidden in a Bible in his room. Investigators obtained a warrant for this Bible and indeed found pictures of the house. 2 months later, the Tucson police chief announced that they had a suspect, 36-year-old Christopher Clements, who had been charged with not 1, but 2 murders. The thing is, on March 3, 2017, when Christopher described to agents the location where they would find Isabelle, he mentioned an important marker, a pile of tires that clearly did not appear there in just 1 day. This instruction immediately alarmed the agents, because a few years ago, the police found the body of a teenage girl from Tucson near that same tire pile. The girl's name was Maribel Gonzalez. In June 2014, 2 years had passed since Isabelle's disappearance, when a rescue service dispatcher answered a horrifying call. A woman reported a body she had noticed by the roadside. The police who arrived on the call found signs that someone had been dragged on the ground, the smell of decay, and a naked body buried under the pile of tires. It was a location significantly distant from the nearest houses. The police shared with the media a photo of a chain with an anchor that the girl was wearing, as well as a tattoo on her collarbone, in hopes that the public would help identify her. Indeed, several people called the police saying that it was 13-year-old Maribel Gonzalez. Maribel's family said that she was seeing a 20-year-old man named Mariano. They had been together for 3 years but broke up a month before Maribel disappeared. Mariano told the police that she sent him a message around 11 to 12 p.m. on the day of her disappearance, asking him to pick her up because she had a fight with her mother. He ignored her message because he had to get up early for work. He never saw her again. Her boyfriend said that she loved to walk alone, even at night. She also liked to go to the mall, the same one near Isabelle's house where Christopher Clements worked. The police linked these cases based on the fact that the bodies were found in close proximity to each other. Christopher's DNA was compared to the DNA found on Maribel, and it matched. Isabelle was kidnapped and killed 2 years before Maribel. Could the perpetrator have been caught after the first crime and prevented Maribel's death? It turns out that Christopher's name came up during the investigation before his conversation with the agents in 2018, more than once. As it is already known, the officers contacted all individuals who committed sexual crimes and lived nearby Isabelle, violent acts against women and children. The list contained 16 names, including Christopher. He was listed as a Class 3 offender, meaning with a very high likelihood of reoffending. The police talked to him, but obviously, he was able to convince the officer that he had nothing to do with the case. Perhaps his girlfriend provided him with an alibi. Furthermore, after Isabelle's disappearance, her parents asked to recall any unexpected meetings, uninvited guests, traders, advertising agents, distributors, anyone who could arouse suspicion. Rebecca immediately remembered a man who was interested in their red Acura. He came twice, but the woman did not know his name, and he never entered the house. Interestingly, Christopher also mentioned that meeting during the interrogations. This is what he told FBI agents on February 10, 2017. According to him, two people pretended to be interested in the car. In fact, they needed to make sure that Sergio lived at that address. They approached Rebecca, and she gave them the phone number and said that they needed to talk about the possibility of buying from her husband Sergio. Thus, the men confirmed what they wanted. Christopher said that he just knew about this visit, but he himself never approached the Celis's house. However, during the conversation, he several times referred to we instead of they, as if confessing that one of the men was him. Christopher's description of the visit coincides with Rebecca's story, except for one detail. The woman described only one man who matched Christopher's description and drove the same car as he did. But her description differs slightly from the description given by her husband. What if the police had followed this lead immediately after Isabelle's disappearance? Would it have led them to Christopher Clements? Investigators believe that the kidnapping of Isabelle was not spontaneous. Christopher had planned his crimes. He repeatedly called the home of the woman from whom he stole gold coins when she was not home. He also called the Celis family home as early as October 2011. The day after the kidnapping, Christopher changed his phone number and washed his car. If cleaning his car usually cost him around $10, $35, this time he paid $110. However, changing his phone number did not help, as phone records linked Christopher to two crimes. Footprints found at the scene of Isabelle's kidnapping matched sneakers that no one in the Celis family wore, but which Christopher was often seen wearing and even photographed in. Detectives also studied photos on his devices and found a miniature snapshot. It was a selfie of a man on the front seat of a car who looked like Clements, and a little girl lying on the back seat who was extremely similar to Isabelle. The photo was shown to Sergio and Rebecca. The woman agreed that the girl resembled Isabelle, but she could not say for sure because the image quality was terrible. Christopher claimed the child in the photo was his son. But when the photo was shown to Melissa, his fiancée, she began to shake. She did not recognize the child as her own. The child in the photo did not resemble the 1.5-year-old fair-haired boy. Instead, it was more like a dark-haired girl with her hair braided, which Isabelle's mother had done just before the kidnapping. The defense argued that the footprints were initially described as work boots. Christopher did not have his phone with him during those calls, and the blood in Isabelle's bedroom probably appeared before the kidnapping. Christopher's lawyers successfully pushed for two separate trials, one for the Isabelle case and one for the Maribel case, so that the prosecutor could not present evidence for both crimes at once. However, this did not help him much because he had already been found guilty of Maribel Gonzalez's murder. He still has to face trial for the kidnapping of Isabelle. Lola Chomnalez was born on November 4, 1999, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She grew up in the family of Adriana Belmonte and Diego Chomnalez, the son of the renowned chef Beatriz Chomnalez. In November 2014, when the girl turned 15, her parents decided to gift her a trip to New York for the Christmas holidays. However, before that, they sent their daughter to spend a few days relaxing with her godmother's family in Rocha, Uruguay. On December 27th, Lola arrived in Uruguay, where she was greeted by her godmother, Claudia Fernandez. The girl was clearly in a great mood, which was captured in a photo taken by Claudia. Claudia, her husband Hernan Tuzinkivch, and their two children were happy about Lola's arrival. They had planned to spend these few days together, sunbathing on Barra de Valiz's beach, swimming in the sea, and relaxing. That same evening, Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson visited a drum festival taking place in the city center. Hernan and the boy didn't leave Lola's side in the crowd, but at some point, the boy moved away from them because he was bored. Nevertheless, after the festival, they all returned home together. The next day, the family went to the beach. Around 3 p.m., Lola asked her godmother for permission to take a walk along the beach. She wanted to walk to the spa resort of Aguas Dulces along a fairly popular trail that allowed her to explore the flora and fauna of the area. Since the route was considered popular and safe for walks, and the locals were known for their friendliness, Claudia had no objections. She told Lola what time they would be waiting for her at home and watched as she calmly walked away from them along the beach. Lola was wearing a bikini and denim shorts. She carried a backpack containing a sarong, a book, her identification, a water bottle, and a towel. She didn't have her phone with her. Obviously, there was poor reception on the beach. The backpack also contained a wallet with 2,000 Uruguayan pesos. Several hours passed, it got dark, and Lola still hadn't returned. Her godmother became worried. The family walked along the route that Lola had planned to take, but she was nowhere to be found. In the evening, Claudia called Lola's parents to explain what had happened. She told Adriana that she had already contacted the police. However, it took another 45 minutes before they arrived at the station and reported the teenager's disappearance. The police began the search for Lola. Since she disappeared during a walk on the beach, it was thoroughly searched both lengthwise and crosswise. Helicopters and search dogs were brought in to assist in the search. Lola's parents immediately arrived in Uruguay to help the police. Almost simultaneously with the start of the investigation, it became known that Adriana and Diego were receiving anonymous calls. The caller did not ask for a ransom or make any demands. They simply stated that Lola was with them and that she was fine. Unfortunately, this turned out to be untrue. 2 days later, on December 30th, her body was found partially covered in sand on the beach. She was in an area with many dunes and dense vegetation. There were shallow knife cuts on her neck and signs of blows on her head. The autopsy revealed that Lola was attacked from behind, then dragged or forced to the location where she was found. The killer pressed her face into the sand for a prolonged period until she suffocated. This was determined by the presence of sand in her lungs. After the news of the crime became known, there was an unprecedented uproar in the press of Argentina and Uruguay. As often happens in such cases, journalists began to put forward theories about what could have happened. The suspicions of the Uruguayan police and the media immediately fell on the family of Lola's godmother, especially on Hernan, and there were several reasons for that. Firstly, they claimed to Adriana and Diego that they had already contacted the police, although they actually delayed before going to the station. Secondly, the media tried to see something sinister in the fact that Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson went to a drum festival together, but at some point, the boys separated from them, leaving the girl with Hernan. A hypothesis related to violence against Lola emerged, but the forensic expert found no evidence to support this. However, there were other reasons to suspect them. Claudia and Hernan immediately hired a lawyer, and not a single family member agreed to take a polygraph test. Lola's parents added fuel to the fire by making a series of bold statements. In particular, Diego stated that he had long ceased to trust Hernan, which provoked further questions. If he didn't trust the man, why did he allow his daughter to go on vacation with them? It is important to note that Claudia and Adriana had been friends for 25 years. Hernan was Claudia's second husband, and Lola's parents had known him for about 5 years. They all originally lived in Argentina, but Hernan and Claudia moved to Uruguay. When Hernan was interrogated, the investigators noted contradictory statements, which led to his arrest on December 31st. Claudia was arrested on suspicion of concealing evidence. Her son was also detained because he was suspected of making those anonymous calls. It is not confirmed with certainty that he was the one who called Adriana and Diego, but it is evident that those calls were a failed attempt at a joke. Nevertheless, the police interrogated all three family members for several days, but there was no evidence against them. The investigators explained that they found some discrepancies in their testimonies, but they were insignificant. Hernan claimed they returned home at 11 o'clock, while his son said it was 12. Besides that, the police had nothing to charge Hernan, Claudia, or her son with. Therefore, on January 2, 2015, they were all released. Apparently, after various public statements, the relationship between the friends suffered. Claudia and her loved ones never spoke to Lola's parents again, nor did they pick up the phone to offer condolences. Adriana believes that their lawyer may have given them such advice. However, she believes that as friends, a simple human gesture would have been to call and express condolences, especially considering their 25 years of friendship. A few days after the discovery of the body, Lola's pink backpack was found. It was also buried in the sand about 200 meters from where Lola's body was found. This immediately raised a lot of questions. How did the police initially not find the body and now the backpack, despite thoroughly searching the entire beach and its surroundings multiple times? Additionally, the authorities in the town had claimed from the beginning that the beach was a very safe area. But it was at least strange because drug dealers operated there, especially in the area where the body was found. Nonetheless, almost all of the girl's belongings remained in the backpack, except for 2,000 pesos that the perpetrator took from her wallet. Furthermore, the towel and documents had blood stains on them. Forensic experts examined these items and found Lola's DNA on them, but it was mixed with male DNA. Since suspicions had not been completely lifted from Hernan, his DNA was compared to the one found. They checked it against the Uruguayan police database, but there were no matches there either. After the discovery of the backpack, one suspect caused a big stir. He was suspected based on witness testimonies regarding his whereabouts on the day of the murder. According to local residents, a man nicknamed El Conejo, the Rabbit, was working on a roof near the beach at the time the girl went for a walk. In the middle of the day, the man went for lunch, and his colleagues knew that he didn't have any money with him. However, he returned with food and cash. This immediately raised the question of where he got the food if he didn't buy it. But that's not all. Someone even claimed to have seen him with a pink backpack on the day of Lola's disappearance. One newspaper wrote that he confessed to the murder, and other media outlets picked up the news. However, it turned out to be untrue. The man provided an explanation of where he got the food. Although the police suspected that he had actually stolen it from beachgoers, there was no evidence connecting him to Lola's case. He never confessed to anything, and after his release, he filed a lawsuit against the newspapers that spread unverified news. At this point, the investigation significantly stalled. The main suspects had already been released, and the investigators had no leads to pursue. At first glance, it seemed that the girl didn't know anyone in the town, but she had managed to attend a drum festival in the city center, and being sociable and open, she freely interacted with people. Therefore, the police had to investigate this lead. They detained and interrogated about 40 people, mainly vendors and dealers from the beach, but they were all eventually released. The situation was further aggravated by the constant changes in prosecutors and judges, and whenever a new prosecutor was appointed, they would review the case from scratch. This significantly hindered the investigation. But on February 18, 2015, there seemed to be some progress in the case. An anonymous call was made to the police. The caller stated that Angel Moreira, also known as El Cachila or Keisha, was involved in the crime. The police arrested and interrogated the man. He worked on the beach, parking cars. Angel explained that he met Lola when she was walking along the beach. He approached her to offer some souvenir trinkets for sale. They exchanged a few sentences about where the girl came from when Lola mentioned feeling dizzy. Angel suggested that they go to a shady area. He took her to a place where tall bushes and dunes provided some shade and coolness. There, the girl fell to her knees. Angel tried to check her pulse, but not hearing it, he got scared and ran away. The statement sounded extremely strange, but without evidence, the police had to release him. 4 years passed when the new prosecutor in Jorge Bay's case reviewed the materials and decided to interrogate Angel again. After the interrogation on May 22, 2019, the man was arrested. This time he was charged with obstruction of justice. His DNA did not match the DNA on Lola's towel and documents, so the prosecutor concluded that he was covering up the person who was truly guilty of the crime. Bass explained that in Angel's statements made in 2015, he revealed details that only someone who was with Lola at the time of the murder could have known. He knew that Lola fell to her knees on the sand, and a forensic expert confirmed this. However, Lola didn't fall because she suddenly felt dizzy, but because she had received shallow knife wounds. Despite Angel's arrest, the Chomnalez family still awaited an answer to the main question for several more years. Until geneticist Natalia Sandberg became interested in the case, 7 years after the murder, the case took a decisive turn. And how the investigators found the suspect resembles a plot from a detective novel. It occurred to Natalia Sandberg to trace the genetic DNA trace of an unknown man found on Lola's towel and documents. There were no matches on the paternal line, but the examination of the maternal line revealed a small match with a prisoner serving time for murder. In other words, the man who left his blood on Lola's towel is related to the man currently serving a sentence. The third crime, in which the victims were Marines who died in the naval complex on Cerro de Montevideo, was the tip of the iceberg that allowed investigators to reach the true killer of Lola Chomnalez. The murders took place on Sunday morning, May 31, 2020. Juan Manuel Escobar, Alex Galinia, and Alan Rodriguez were found shot in the head. The police established that the killer is Jonathan Brand Gundy. Jonathan was born in Rocha. When the police found his mother and examined her DNA, it became clear that they were looking for another son of the woman, Jonathan's half-brother. The woman told the investigators that she had given birth to 11 children from different fathers, including 8 boys. But only one son was given up for adoption when he was 18 days old. It turned out that he was the one the police had been searching for 7 years. Their new suspect was named Leonardo Senar. In 2014, during Lola's murder, Senar was homeless, spending his days and nights between La Paloma, Chuy, and Castillos. He lived in these places through odd jobs. But recently, he settled in the city of Chuy, lived with a girlfriend, and worked in a bakery. The man had a history of police records from 2003 to 2009 for aggression, theft, and violence. Despite his run-ins with the law, his DNA was not stored in the database because the database itself was created after 2012. Therefore, on May 18, 2022, the police obtained a search warrant for his house. They anticipated that the man would refuse to provide his DNA, and they were right. However, forensic experts examined the man's toothbrush and comb. To the surprise and joy of the forensic experts, the DNA match was 99.9%, confirming it was his DNA. On May 19th, the suspect was arrested at the border with Brazil. During the interrogation, Leonardo claimed that he had no connection to the crime. As for his DNA found on the identification card and the girl's towel, he explained that he found a pink backpack on the beach. When he looked inside, he saw a wallet with 2,000 pesos and stole the money. Regarding the blood, he said that a few hours before, he cut himself with a bottle shard at work, and when he reached into the backpack, the bandage fell off and the cut started bleeding. Therefore, he wiped his hand with Lola's towel. However, there were several inconsistencies in his version. Firstly, his blood was not simply found on the girl's belongings. it was mixed with her blood. This couldn't have happened if he found the backpack and just took out the wallet. Secondly, according to his own words, someone else, not Leonardo, took Lola's backpack on the 28th, the day of the murder, after Leonardo stole the money and inexplicably buried it 4 kilometers away from where it was found, without taking anything from it. Even the suspect couldn't deny the absurdity of this story. Finally, his colleagues who worked with him in December 2014 didn't recall the incident with a broken bottle and Leonardo's cut. Moreover, according to documentation, Leonardo was no longer employed at the brewery on the day of the crime. Here is what the police believe actually happened. In the middle of the day on December 28, 2014, when Lola went for a walk on the beach, she was intercepted by Leonardo and Angel. They dragged her into an area with dunes and bushes. There, Lola tried to escape, and the kidnappers struck her several times on the head and stabbed her in the neck, causing her to fall to her knees. However, these wounds were not fatal, and Lola continued to resist. It is likely that she also screamed loudly, trying to attract the attention of other vacationers or beach vendors. In an attempt to silence Lola, they pressed her face into the sand. They pressed for too long, causing Lola to suffocate. The police believe that the motive for the crime was violence, although the assailants were unable to carry out their intended act and ended up killing her because they did not expect such fierce resistance from the teenage girl. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that Leonardo was previously tried for a case very similar to Lola's. That case occurred in 2009 when Leonardo was 26 years old. The victim was a 15-year-old girl, just like Lola. Leonardo followed her for several blocks before attacking her with a knife. He dragged the victim to a remote wooded area where he assaulted her. The Uruguayan police are convinced that at least 2 people were involved in the attack on Lola. Therefore, they charged Leonardo with aggravated murder and Angel with harboring a criminal. Jorge Base demanded a sentence of 10 years of imprisonment for Angel and 15 to 30 years for Leonardo. In June 2021, Angel, who had been in prison since 2019, was released by a judge's decision granting him conditional early release under oath. Despite psychiatric and psychological evaluations characterizing Angel as an aggressive and impulsive individual lacking impulse control, the judge found no grounds to accuse him of harboring a criminal, as harboring entails assisting the criminal after the crime has been committed. In this case, Angel should have been charged as an accomplice. Therefore, according to the judge, Angel Moreira's actions do not fall under the category of harboring. However, the prosecutor filed an appeal against the judge's decision, stating that Angel was present before, during, and after the crime. Despite their initial suspicions, Lola's parents, Adriana and Diego, trust the evidence presented by the police, agree that 2 suspects were involved in the crime, and hope for a swift verdict. The story of Tim and Charlene's meeting resembled a romantic fairy tale. 2 intelligent, attractive, and successful young individuals were ready for marriage and, upon meeting each other, immediately understood that their union was meant to be. Over the course of 3 years, they tied the knot, moved into their own home, and welcomed a little daughter into their lives. However, after the arrival of their child, money became tight for the family, so Tim and Charlene decided to sell their beloved pickup truck and buy a simpler car. In May 2013, Charlene posted an online ad, and now she nervously paced the room of her house. Tim had been gone for over an hour, and she was starting to panic. Even if the men had decided to take the car for a test drive, they had been gone for too long. Charlene called her husband multiple times, but all the calls went to voicemail. He hadn't responded to her messages. Although she knew for certain that Tim had charged his phone before leaving for work, when he still hadn't returned late into the night, Charlene called the police to report her husband's disappearance. The Hamilton police took the disappearance of the 32-year-old man very seriously. Canine search teams and search and rescue teams were deployed, not to mention the hundreds of Ancaster residents who joined in the search efforts. Despite the community's involvement in the search, many suspected that the man had simply run away, possibly due to a disillusioned life or accumulated debts. However, the detectives found no evidence to support these theories. The police organized a press conference where Charlene directly addressed the abductors, pleading for them to release Tim and emphasizing the need for their little daughter to have her father, and for her, a husband. Barely holding back tears, she added, "It was just a car, just a silly car." It was only when Charlene uttered those words that everyone realized, all at once, that the car was the very reason for the man's disappearance. And thus, anyone could become a victim simply because they decided to sell their pickup truck. 3 days later, Tim's phone was found. It was discovered by a worker in the grass near a construction site, approximately 20 minutes away from Hamilton. However, there was no sign of Tim or his pickup truck nearby. The discovery of the phone itself was not significant since the police had already obtained all the necessary information from the telecommunications company. Detectives started investigating the phone number from which potential buyers of the pickup truck had called Tim. It turned out that the phone was registered under a false name and address. But Tim was not the only one listed in the outgoing calls. The persistence of the criminal who had used the number multiple times led the police to Igor Tumanenko, an Israeli army veteran who was selling a similar Dodge Ram and had posted an advertisement online. Igor told investigators that he had taken a test drive with 2 men just 2 days before Tim's disappearance, but unlike Tim, Igor had returned home after the drive. Perhaps it was because Igor was a tall, robust former soldier who could resist attackers if necessary. But most importantly, Igor provided the investigators with a description of the men, mentioning that the tall guy had a small bag slung over his shoulder and a tattoo on his wrist that read ambition. During the subsequent press conference, the police shared the description of the 2 men with journalists, and within 2 days, colleagues from Toronto contacted them, claiming to know exactly who the Hamilton police were looking for. They identified the wanted man as a young millionaire, playboy, and one of Canada's most eligible bachelors, 27-year-old Dellen Millard. Long before the police took an interest in him, Dellen Millard was a young prodigy. At the age of 14, he made headlines as the youngest Canadian to pilot a helicopter and an airplane on the same day. Born in 1985 to Wayne and Madeline Millard, Dellen was the heir to the multi-million-dollar airline company, Millard Air, founded by his grandfather. However, by the time he turned 20, the guy dropped out of university and led a rather idle lifestyle. Dellen threw poolside parties, drove the most luxurious cars, and was always surrounded by glamorous women. He allowed his friends to live in his numerous houses and apartments, and he moved so frequently that some of the household staff never even met him. 2 months before the events described, his father unexpectedly passed away, leaving Dellen as the inheritor of the family fortune. According to his friends' estimates, it ranged from $10 to $20 million. It was hard to believe that a millionaire, with a garage full of luxurious cars, would be capable of kidnapping someone over a pickup truck. The police put Dellen under surveillance and discovered that he was friends with an employee of the airline named Mark Smick. Unlike Dellen, Mark did not come from wealthy parents. In fact, he made a living by selling illicit substances. However, what was of greater importance to the police was the extensive list of criminal offenses associated with Mark. At the same time, by comparing the footage from several surveillance cameras, the investigators pieced together the events of that evening. Shortly after the pickup truck left Tim's house, a dark SUV can be seen closely following it in the video. Dellen was behind the wheel of one vehicle, while Mark was driving the other. It cannot be stated with certainty, but Tim was likely already dead. Half an hour later, the cars stopped, and the criminals changed the license plates of Tim's pickup truck to avoid police detection. Now that they had obtained the desired pickup, their next task was to get rid of its owner. At 2 a.m., they arrived at the Millard Air hangar. The pickup was towing a large trailer with some heavy equipment on it. Mark and Dellen entered the hangar, and soon sparks and flames started to emerge from the equipment on the trailer. This mysterious fire would burn throughout the night. Early in the morning, when Tim had been missing for 12 hours, Millard Air employees received a message from Dellen instructing them to stay away from the hangar. Arthur Jennings, an employee of Millard Air, recalls that the demand was explained to him as company policy. On Tuesday, he obediently avoided entering the hangar, but on Wednesday, he came across a pickup truck identical to the one described in the news. The man didn't know what to do. Deciding to photograph the vehicle and its identification number, he dialed the anonymous crime reporting hotline and requested it to be checked. They confirmed that it was the same vehicle. The man was so shocked that he felt physically ill. Fearing for himself and his family's lives, he only reported what he had learned on Friday. By that time, the pickup truck was no longer in the hangar. Fortunately, thanks to the phone data and Igor's testimony, the police already had a suspect. On May 11th, 4 days after Tim's disappearance, Dellen was arrested by the Hamilton police. Charlene was relieved, thinking that her husband would now be found quickly. She didn't know that the police no longer expected to find him alive. Acting on a tip from neighbors, officers arrived at Dellen's mother's house, where they discovered the pickup truck in a large trailer on the driveway. The pickup had been partially dismantled and meticulously cleaned, but despite that, they found Dellen's fingerprints and traces of blood inside. The keys to the pickup are still hanging on Dellen's keychain. But what about the equipment that the pickup was towing that night? The police searched all of Dellen's apartments and homes. On his farm, they found an industrial incinerator for burning various types of waste. This huge furnace was the very equipment from which sparks of flame were seen on the night of Tim's disappearance. Inside the furnace, forensic experts found small bone fragments, including human teeth. Due to the intensity of the fire, obtaining DNA was impossible. However, it is presumed that the bones belonged to Tim, and on May 14th, the police officially announced his death. Astounded by their findings, the investigators wondered if there could be other victims among Dellen's acquaintances. They continued to search Dellen's farm, but by that time the Toronto police had already missed 3 crucial clues, each of which could have saved Tim. The first was the mysterious disappearance of 23-year-old aspiring actress Laura Babcock. By the time arrests were made in connection with Tim's murder, Laura was already missing for about a year. She had met Dellen at a pub in Toronto. They dated for no more than a month, after which they remained friends, although romantic encounters still occurred. In 2010, Laura met Sean Lerner. Sean was a complete opposite of Dellen, and he was clearly in love with Laura. Although their relationship ended after 18 months, they remained friends. After graduating from college, Laura had difficulty getting her life together. She was depressed, had arguments with her parents over their house rules, and found herself practically homeless, staying with friends. To make ends meet, Laura turned to the escort industry. Upon learning about her friend's difficulties, Sean paid for a motel room where Laura could stay with her pet and provided her with an iPad to search for more conventional work. It was Sean Lerner who organized a party for Laura's 22nd birthday, inviting Dellen and his future girlfriend, Christina Nuga, among others. Clearly, it was this love triangle that led to the tragedy. Laura continued seeing Dellen behind Christina's back, but Christina likely suspected something, and on Laura's 23rd birthday, she sent her a message saying, "Happy birthday." It has been exactly a year since Dellen and I became intimate. Laura immediately retaliated, saying, "Great, and I was with him 2 weeks ago." This message genuinely upset Christina about her boyfriend's infidelity. Dellen had to assure her that he would deal with Laura, promising Christina, "First, I'll hurt her, then I'll make her leave. I'll remove her from our lives." On July 3rd, 2012, Laura went home to her parents and left her dog, suitcase with belongings, and a shoebox containing approximately $1,000 in cash. She then went to the subway station, where Dellen picked her up and drove her to his home. At 7:03, Laura made a call to check her voicemail, and her phone connected to a tower near Dellen's home. After that, her phone stopped working completely. At 7:30, Dellen informed Mark that he was on a mission and would return in an hour. The next day, Laura's iPad was connected to Dellen's computer, and its name was changed to Mark's iPad. Afterward, Dellen took a picture of an object wrapped in blue tarp. In light of the events that unfolded, the photo speaks for itself. Dellen asked a worker from his aviation company to build a massive furnace for him, but when that experiment failed, he ordered a waste incinerator. On July 23rd, he sent a message to Mark stating that the barbecue was hot and ready for meat. Dellen's internet search history during that time revealed his interest in the effective temperature for cremation. Finally, he took a photo of Mark with the pipe from the incinerator and filmed the flames erupting from it. On July 14th, Laura's family and Sean Lerner reported her disappearance to the police, but upon learning about her recent mental state and profession, the officers didn't pursue her case, assuming she would return on her own. However, Sean refused to let the matter rest. He obtained a printout of Laura's recent calls and conducted his own investigation. It didn't take him long to discover that the last 8 calls from her phone were made to Dellen Millard. Sean called Dellen, who initially ignored the calls but eventually agreed to meet him and discuss the situation. Dellen claimed that Laura had asked him for illicit substances but didn't receive them. He then told Sean not to hope to see her again. Sean relayed all the information he had gathered to the police, presenting them with Dellen Millard's name on a silver platter. However, the detectives once again refused to take any action. Laura's case was forgotten, but a year later, when Sean heard about Dellen's arrest for murder, he quickly connected the dots and convinced Laura's family to call the Hamilton police. Unlike their counterparts in Toronto, the Hamilton officers showed great interest in their story. After the arrest of the men, Laura's iPad and her sports bag with her name and address written by her hand were found at Mark's house. In addition to incriminating photos on the iPad, investigators found a video in which Mark raps and essentially confesses to burning the girl's body and throwing her phone into the river.
Outside the home, and if you go swimming, you can find the phone.
Laura was still considered missing in November 2012 when the Toronto police missed 2 crucial leads. They were of a slightly different nature, but equally important to the case. An online advertisement for a motorcycle appeared, and just a few days later, its owner, Marty McDougall, came home to find that both the motorcycle and its trailer were gone. He knew that there was a surveillance camera right across the road that could help identify the thieves. Marty contacted the police, and an officer came and took the camera footage. However, despite Marty's persistent attempts to reach the investigator, he heard nothing from the police. It wasn't until several months later, after Tim's murder, that the Hamilton police contacted Marty, having discovered the stripped motorcycle and trailer. Where were they? In Millard's aviation hangar. This raises the question of why the police didn't use the footage to track Millard months earlier and save Tim. The third crucial lead that the police missed was the sudden demise of Wayne Millard, Dellen's father. After speaking with family members and colleagues, the police discovered that Wayne had threatened to cut off the funding for his son's extravagant lifestyle. Dellen was spending enormous sums of money and showed little interest in the family business. Wayne didn't want his son to destroy the fruits of his family's hard work and was planning to put an end to it, but he didn't get the chance. Wayne was found in his bedroom, deceased. He had suffered a gunshot wound to the head, and a revolver was found nearby. Initially, the case seemed obvious to the police. However, now that the detectives knew about Dellen, they wanted to re-examine the facts. At that time, he was not considered a suspect, although it's unclear why investigators didn't pay closer attention to his behavior. He appeared too calm, relaxed, and gave very strange answers to questions. However, when a relative passes away and someone needs to identify the body, if someone asked when was the last time they saw that person, nobody would answer, 5 minutes ago, to the coroner. No, a person would recall the last time they saw their relative alive. The reason for this is that most people don't want to think about death. When answering such a question, the brain automatically goes back to a previous, more positive moment. But the problem with Dellen is that the murder brought him pleasure, so when asked about the last time he saw Wayne, he immediately thought about the body. One more important detail: Wayne was cremated, but his hands were tested for gunshot residue, and none was found. In combination with the odd behavior of the millionaire's son and the apparent financial benefit for the heir, it's strange that the police quickly closed the case. As for the family's friends and journalists, they were informed that the man died from a brain aneurysm. Since they didn't know the true cause of his death, no one suspected anything. Otherwise, they would likely have demanded a thorough investigation. When the detectives finally took up the case after Dellen and Mark's arrest, it wasn't difficult for them to discover that the revolver from which the bullet was fired had been purchased by Dellen prior to Laura Babcock's disappearance, and his DNA was found on it. Initially, Dellen claimed that he stayed at Mark's house before returning home around 6 p.m. and finding his father. However, phone records showed that he was at home from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m., precisely during Wayne's time of death. It's as if the accumulating evidence against the two was not enough. Dellen secretly passed 65 letters to Christine from prison, instructing her on what statements she should give. He ordered her to destroy all the letters immediately after reading them, but she did not comply. During the trial, Dellen and Mark almost confessed to the murder, shifting blame onto each other. However, in this case, it didn't matter who pulled the trigger. Both accomplices were found guilty of the murders of Tim and Laura and were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Dellen received a similar punishment for his father's murder. The judge ruled that they would serve their sentences consecutively, meaning Dellen would have to spend 75 years in prison before he could even be eligible for parole. This is the maximum sentence ever imposed in the history of Ontario. Dellen's girlfriend, Christine Maro, pleaded guilty to obstructing justice in relation to Tim's death. She revealed that she transported a car trailer and an incinerator to dispose of the evidence. The 24-year-old received a lenient punishment due to her testimony against Dellen and spent 3 months in prison. She later moved to Poland, where she attended medical school. The remains of Laura and Tim were never identified, but it is highly likely that they were found in the incinerator. Dellen Millard grew up in an affluent family and could have had everything he wanted. However, it turned out that what he wanted was to become a criminal. Just 2 years after meeting Mark, they started going on what they called night missions, stealing cars and motorcycles, not for profit, but for the thrill of it. They often burned them on the side of the road or destroyed them in an aircraft hangar. Once considered one of Canada's most eligible bachelors, he officially transformed into a serial killer, accused of murdering his father, former girlfriend, and an unknown person in less than a year. But if Laura and his father stood in Dellen's way, we will probably never know why he killed Tim. Whether out of boredom, audacity, or growing confidence that he could get away with anything, even murder. On February 19, 2001, at the Battlebridge Basin, a part of the Regent's Canal in London, 10 body parts belonging to an unidentified woman were discovered. The body parts were found in 6 different bags and weighed down with bricks. Who was she, and who killed her? These hastily dismembered remains belonged to an ex-girlfriend of John Sweeney, a jealous, perpetually drunken, and vengeful sadist. He referred to himself as a scalp hunter, but the press dubbed him the Canal Killer. Born John Patrick Sweeney on Saturday, October 13, 1956, the boy grew up in Kirkdale, a working-class district of Liverpool. Sweeney's childhood was unremarkable and devoid of significant events. Although his family was poor, his parents instilled in him a sense of pride, moral values, and the importance of hard work. The boy dreamed of studying art, but he was convinced to choose a more reliable profession. Thus, after training as a carpenter, for 5 years John traveled to different countries, working on construction sites with a bag full of tools, pockets full of cash, and eyes fixed on women. It was during this little-known episode of his life that something changed in John. When he returned to Britain several years later, he came back as an envious, jealous, and malicious person whose life was consumed by a passion for alcohol, illicit substances, and violence. Upon returning to Liverpool, John still looked like the boy who had left a few years earlier, with his tousled red hair and mischievous sparks in his eyes. But his almost childlike face, which always seemed kind and smiling, concealed a growing rage within him. After meeting the lovely Anne Bramley in 1976, John married her and moved in with her. Soon after, they had children. However, it was not a happy union. John was either absent from home and uninvolved in raising the children, or he behaved aggressively and horrifically abused his wife. He often used different aliases, such as Joe Johnson, Joe Carroll, or Liverpool Joe, to hide the increasing number of charges against him for various offences. In 1979, after 3 years of marriage, concerned for the safety of her children and repeatedly reporting her husband to the police, Anne made a courageous decision and filed for divorce. 2 years later, she gave John one last chance, believing that he had changed, overcome his addiction, and that a bright future awaited them. But her husband had not changed. He was still intoxicated, drugged, and dangerous, and he was consumed by a desire for revenge. He was not going to allow her to leave him again. Their second marriage lasted barely a year. Anne escaped to her family in the middle of the night. But no matter how far she ran or how carefully she hid, John always found her. In November 1982, settling with her children in a cottage in a small town, and thought she had found refuge, but her peace was shattered because John Sweeney followed her. In the evening, when a piercing wind blew from the hills, covering the moon with dense clouds, and the snow crunched under his feet, John approached the new home of the family. Through a gap in the curtains, he noticed a light in the house but heard no sound and saw no movement. Realizing that nobody was home, the man broke the lock on the back door. Inside, seeing food on the table, children's toys on the floor, and family photos on the fireplace mantel, he felt even more acutely rejected by Anne. John slipped into the darkness of his wife's bedroom, opened the closet, and hid inside. And while he stood there, surrounded by familiar things, inhaling the scent of her perfume, surrounded by everything that reminded him of her departure, John waited for his wife's return with a hammer in one hand and an axe in the other. He didn't have to wait long. Just 2 minutes later, he heard the jingling of her keys. The front door opened, and light sequentially filled each room until he heard quiet footsteps in the bedroom. From the tension, the man's finger joints turned pale as he anxiously gripped the hammer and axe, prepared for a furious attack on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Waiting for the perfect moment, John burst out of the closet and saw 2 police officers in front of him, thick, strong guys who already had handcuffs ready. John dropped the weapons, and thoughts raced through his mind about how to explain who he was and what he was doing in the closet with a hammer and axe. He claimed he was preparing a surprise for his wife. One can only guess what kind of surprise it would have been if the police officers hadn't shown up. However, luckily for Anne and the children, they were having a pleasant evening at the neighbor's house when they heard the sound as if someone had entered their home. Assuming it was a burglar, they called the police. John was arrested, but he was not charged with attempted murder or anything similar. Since it is difficult to prove intentions to commit a crime, and considering that everything happened in what could formally be considered his own home, the law couldn't do anything to him. He was released on the condition of staying away from Anne. John started over and moved to London. He returned to Liverpool only to visit his mother. Although he and Anne crossed paths more than once, they managed to maintain civilized relations for the sake of the children until her death in 2001. In the same year, 10 body parts, placed in 6 separate bags and weighted down with bricks, were dumped at the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London. But the body in the canal did not belong to Anne. John ever again attempted to take her life. Perhaps he never had the opportunity again, perhaps he still loved her, or perhaps he knew it was wrong to deprive the children of a caring mother. Thus, with the same fury in his eyes, jealousy in his heart, and impatient tremor in his hands, John set off once again in search of love, an unsuspecting girl whom he would attempt to control, and her name was Melissa Halstead. But this time, he turned to his other passion, art, and his dark paintings would unveil the veil of mystery over his much more sinister plans. Born in Ohio, Melissa Halstead was a bright, courageous, and cheerful girl whose free-spirited nature was balanced by kindness and inner warmth. Melissa always saw the best in people, and although it took her a long time to trust a stranger enough to become her friend, once you became her friend, you became her friend forever. At the age of 15, scouts from the renowned Ford modeling agency in New York took notice of the beautiful and striking girl, and that's where her career began. She traveled across America, Europe, and Asia. By 1986, after a successful modeling career and obtaining education as a makeup artist and photographer, Melissa settled in London in anticipation of a new chapter in her life. Melissa hardly told her family anything about her new boyfriend, whom everyone called Liverpool Joe. Whatever she saw in this red-haired, moody figure was a mystery to everyone, but whatever it wasn't worth it. Because the man didn't hesitate to disfigure her beautiful face, using his fists in fits of drunken rage. These were alarming signs, and Melissa repeatedly tried to leave. Over the course of 12 months of living together, Melissa and John Sweeney, the police were called to her rescue twice when he brutally beat her. But both times, John only received a slap on the wrist, forcing him to pay a fine of £5. In April 1988, the man frightened poor Melissa so much, waving a knife, that in a gruesome foreshadowing of her fate, she told her sister that if she ever disappeared, it meant John had killed her. This time, the court banned him from ever approaching the girl. Melissa's work visa was about to expire, and she continued to travel thousands of kilometers away from John, visiting Austria, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But no matter how far she went, how skillfully she hid, or how cautiously she noticed traces, he always found her. His paranoia fueled by alcohol, his jealousy fueled by rejection, and the court conditions that had no significance beyond Britain allowed him to track down his supposedly unfaithful girlfriend to her new apartment in Vienna, Austria. Without realizing that the shattered relationship was his fault, and driven mad by the thought that Melissa was cheating on him, John burst into the house through the back door, found and gagged her neighbor, and searched the apartment. He examined every cabinet in search of signs of her infidelity. Melissa had learned from the experiences of his furious attacks. She knew there was no point in arguing, trying to convince him otherwise, or even dignifying him with a response. Instead, understanding that he needed time to cool down, she bought him a ticket to Amsterdam. Whether it was a clever ploy to distract a dangerous lover, a kind gesture to give him a chance to calm down, or an honest promise to resume their relationship is unknown, but it worked. John took the ticket and left. But a few days did not calm him down. On the contrary, he blamed Melissa for everything he had ever experienced because of women who deceived and rejected him. She rejected him like Anne, abandoned him like Anne, and destroyed him like Anne. John's anger came full circle, and it was time to finish what he had started, to seek revenge. On Friday, November 4th, 1988, 4 days later and almost 6 years after the failed attack on Anne, John approached Melissa's apartment. Unlike that night, Melissa was at home. Unlike that night, he didn't break in but knocked on the door. Unlike that night, when Melissa saw her stalker had returned, an argument ensued. But just like that night 6 years ago in Anne's cottage, John was prepared. The knuckles of his right hand turned white with impatience as he clenched a hammer. He told Melissa that he had calmed down and simply forgot something in her apartment. Waiting for the moment when Melissa turned her back to him, John gritted his teeth, his hand shot up, and he brought down the steel edge of the hammer on the girl's head. Melissa felt a powerful blow, and her vision instantly darkened, but miraculously she survived. Lying in a hospital bed with bruises and a brain fracture, she declared that all she wanted was to help him, but now she understood that he truly hated her. John was arrested on the same day. Hatred for the girl continued to boil in him while in prison. In his troubles, he blamed only her. And here he resorted to his favorite pastime again, drawing. His drawings were not only frightening, realistic, and highly detailed, but they also served as a confession of the thoughts and desires that consumed him. His imagination was so deranged that it's hard to describe it in words. The most disturbing sketch he sarcastically titled Romantic Weekend 2 in Austria. But if it could be characterized in any way, it was certainly not romantic. However, Melissa knew nothing about the drawings. She believed his tears and assurances that she was all he had, so she took an unexpected step. The judge sentenced John to 12 months in prison and a 10-year ban on entering Austria to protect his victim from any danger. But he was released earlier after an emotional plea from the person he almost killed, Melissa. And on Monday, March 27, 1989, after serving only half of his sentence, 34-year-old John Sweeney walked free, inhaling the fresh Austrian air as the cold breeze played with his red beard. The stunningly beautiful Blom, a former model, kissed him on the lips. Melissa arrived in a car full of luggage to pick up John. They headed to the Netherlands, where they wouldn't be bothered by the deportation order, to start a new life together. However, those 6 months in prison did nothing to rid the man of his drinking habit, his use of illicit substances, his paranoia, jealousy, and his obsession with violence and torture. And their new home was as libertine and indulgent as it was an unsuitable place for someone like him. Although John occasionally worked, his earnings were only enough for alcohol, and it was Melissa's successful career that allowed them to pay for housing, food, and other expenses. Month after month, the beatings were repeated, which the girl concealed behind expertly applied makeup and poorly thought-out excuses. Thanks to her work as a photographer and makeup artist, she traveled a lot, but the more she was absent, the more John drank and filled himself with jealousy and rage. Finally, in late April 1990, Melissa returned home to Amsterdam, to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend. She decided to break up with him for good. On Thursday, May 3, 1990, in a coastal town called Rotterdam, located 50 miles from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a military-style bag appeared on the surface of a canal. Upon seeing it, 2 police officers decided it was either stolen luggage or discarded trash. Inside, they found the torso of a naked woman. Just the torso, without hands, feet, or a head, and there were no belongings or documents present. The perpetrator had removed them and snapped the unfortunate victim's spine in half to fit her into the bag. She had spent just over a week in the water before being discovered. However, that was all the police could determine for certain because the killer had made maximum efforts to destroy all clues to her identity. The skull injury from a recent attack by her boyfriend could have provided a clue to her identity besides dental records, but all the police had was an unnamed torso, lacking any name, teeth, surgical scars, birthmarks, tattoos, or fingerprints. Since no missing persons matching her description had been reported in Rotterdam, Melissa was marked as Jane Doe and buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. We will never know exactly how or where she died. We do not know how her killer transported her body from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. Perhaps he took a train, wondering what other passengers would think if they knew what was in his bag. But we do know that in Rotterdam, he chose a canal that ran through the heart of the city, waited for the opportune moment, and simply tossed the bag into the water. As Melissa worked a lot and traveled on assignments, her family in Ohio did not immediately realize they hadn't heard from her in a while. The last time she left a message on the answering machine, congratulating her mother on her birthday, and then she stopped calling. So in November 1990, the family hired a lawyer to investigate her disappearance. but they realized it too late. Her apartment was completely empty and meticulously cleaned, with no trace of the former tenants. Melissa had vanished, and John returned to Britain, embarking on his search for love, girls, once again. And her name was Delia Baymer. Having met John at a pub in early 1991, Delia was struck by the charisma of a man who lived a seemingly heavenly life. Being overly trusting by nature, she quickly allowed John to move into her apartment, just 1.5 miles from the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London's Paddington. But together they appeared to be a strange pair. She was a fragile blonde, a nurse who saved lives, and he was a red-haired psychopath with one past murder, one attempted murder, and at least one future murder. Delia brought warmth and coziness into the home, while John complemented it with illicit substances, alcohol, a tarantula, stacks of horror magazines, and a collection of gruesome paintings depicting scenes of violence, severed body parts, blood, torture, and headless female bodies. As before, he quickly revealed his true nature, striving to exert full control over Delia's life and exploding with rage if things didn't go the way he wanted. 2 years later, Delia gathered the courage to ask him to leave. He agreed, but he kept delaying the moment, continuing to exert control over every aspect of her life. In 1994, Delia managed to escape his watchful gaze and spent a day with a friend. When she returned, John flew into a rage. As punishment, he tied the helpless woman to her bed, using the same rope he had once used to bind Melissa's lifeless body. For unbearable 48 hours, he tortured Delia, repeatedly violating her, beating her, strangling her, and threatening her. John held a gun to her head and threatened to cut out her tongue with a kitchen knife if she screamed. In his frenzy, he began to tell her the story of his previous girlfriend, who had tried to leave him and supposedly met her end in the canals of Rotterdam. Allegedly, he caught her with 2 Germans. He killed all 3, not knowing what to do with them. He sat with the bodies for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he dismembered them, packed them into bags, and threw them into the canal. Delia had studied John well and didn't even attempt to argue, curse, resist, or scream. She didn't even allow herself to think about it, as if he could read her thoughts. Perhaps that's why, like Anne, he didn't kill her. And no one knows why. The man fled to Germany, but since the police knew his appearance and the fake names he used, he was arrested and deported back to Britain. Her tormentor sat in prison, but Delia was convinced that he would find a way to get to her sooner or later. On Thursday, December 26, 1994, 3 days before Christmas, John was put under house arrest. Just a few hours later, as the sun was setting, with a cold winter wind and snowflakes falling from the sky, Delia finished her shift and carefully rode her bicycle onto the road leading to her home. The dark street was empty, illuminated only by the flickering lights of television screens, Christmas garlands, and the dim orange glow of street lamps. Delia leaned her bicycle against the fence near the steps that led to her apartment entrance. It was quiet, peaceful, and safe, or so it seemed. As always, she propped the door with a brick and went back to get her bicycle. Delia was already halfway up the steps, looking around, asking herself if he was hiding in the darkness, when she glanced to the right again and saw his enraged face. Without wasting a second, Delia quickly pushed the brick, allowing the door of her house to slam shut right in front of her. She knew it was better to confront John on the street. If he pushed her into the house, she wouldn't stand a chance to escape. With raised hands, bulging eyes, and clenched teeth, John struck the fragile and defenseless woman with a 2-kilogram axe while reaching for a knife. He hit her in the chest, piercing her lung, then her thigh, and swung the axe, severing the tip of his finger. Delia could have died, but she didn't. She pulled the bicycle towards her to shield herself from the blows. The sound of the axe scraping against the metal of the bicycle was heard by her neighbor, Giles Allen. Grabbing a baseball bat, he rushed out of his house and chased after John on the street. But John quickly vanished into the darkness, being the coward that he was, afraid to confront a worthy opponent, someone like himself. For the next 6 years, while John remained on the run, friends warned Delia to be cautious, believing that he would come back to finish what he started. But Delia didn't care anymore because she was no longer herself. And even though, after 6 years, 10 parts of a woman's body, carefully packed into 6 different bags, would be discovered at Battlebridge Basin, a London dock in the Regent's Canal, bearing a striking resemblance to Melissa's murder, Delia Bosma would not be the victim. That woman was still alive, because she still had to become John Sweeney's future ex-girlfriend. Having gone on the run, John didn't make much effort to lay low. He headed north, where he visited his mother, as well as his ex-wife Anne and their children. On January 2, 1995, just 11 days after the attack on Delia, John sent a letter to the police and Scotland Yard, boasting about his crimes and claiming they would never catch him. Since the red-haired butcher was easy to find, he decided to hide in another European country. He disappeared from all radars for 6 years. What happened to him during those years, where he was, what he did, and whom he possibly killed, remains unknown. The only certainty is that he returned to his gruesome drawings, promising brutal retribution against women who dared reject him. However, in early 2000, he came back to Britain, where he resumed his search for love. And her name was Paula Fields. As one of 11 children in a poor family living in the poorest district of Liverpool, Paula's childhood, along with her brothers and sisters, was challenging. But their troubles were only beginning. When Paula was 9 years old, her mother passed away, and the children were sent to relatives or placed in shelters. As she grew older, Paula tried her best to become a great mother to her own children. That's why she decided to move to London in search of a better life for her 3 sons, but things only got worse. After 2 years of constant hunger, suffering, and despair, she turned to the oldest profession. In the autumn of 2000, as a homeless woman of loose morals, with no chance of regaining custody of her children, who had been taken by Child Protective Services, Paula's life seemed to hit rock bottom. It was during this time that she met and fell in love with a bearded, red-haired butcher known as Liverpool Joe. Paula, battered and beaten, moved in with him. But what began as an endless cycle of emotional blackmail, psychological pressure, and physical violence soon led to her demise. At 9:30 a.m. on Friday, December 15, 2000, Paula was last seen entering John's apartment. Just 2 days later, the true nature of her beloved was revealed, and 2 days before he moved out of the rented flat, Paula was never seen alive again. On Monday, February 19, 2001, during the school holidays, 2 school children were fishing at the Battlebridge Basin when they noticed a partially submerged black bag. Being boys, they retrieved the heavy bag, hoping to find treasures or at least stolen valuable items. They were shocked for the rest of their lives when they opened the bag and found bricks and body parts. The police recovered 5 more similar bags from the water, but they did not find any hands, feet, heads, or any items or documents. Like Melissa, Paula could have become another Jane Doe, as John had once again gotten away with murder. Or he would have, if he hadn't made a huge mistake. He left one victim alive. Since the police became aware that the wanted assailant for the attack on Delia Bosma had been seen in London, all constables received his description. On Friday, March 23, 2001, the red-haired butcher Joe Johnson was spotted at a construction site. Knowing that he might be armed, the police added their most prepared officers. He indeed had a knife and a gun in his locker. In his apartment, they found more weapons, ammunition, machetes, a homemade bamboo garrote, a baseball bat, a wig with brunette hair, a change of clothes, an axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, a bag with saws and hammers, and over 200 drawings and poems depicting torture, dismemberment, and the death of women. For the attempted murder of Delia, John was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And although he boasted about many murders of his former girlfriends, as well as presumably 2 Germans whom he allegedly caught in bed with Melissa, without evidence, the law was powerless, and investigators feared that John would be released early from prison in a few years and simply disappear. But then another victim of John provided an important clue that helped remove the dangerous criminal from the streets forever. And she did it from beyond the grave. On June 12, 2007, thanks to the advancement of genetic technology, the Dutch police obtained the DNA of the woman whose torso was pulled out of the Rotterdam Canal 18 years ago. By joining forces, Scotland Yard and the Dutch police not only identified Melissa and Paula but also linked their murders, the method of disposing of the bodies, and the identity of the killer, John Swine. In court, the most reliable and crucial evidence against the defendant became his own paintings and poems. Detectives were able to establish a chilling connection between the drawings and the murders he was suspected of. In particular, on one drawing, investigators noticed an element hidden under correction fluid. Under ultraviolet light, forensic experts were able to see what was drawn there. It turned out to be a tombstone with the inscription, "Rest in peace, Melissa." But why would he hide this fragment of the painting if he considered all his works simply art? Because it was evidence he knew about Melissa's death long before her remains were identified. Another painting titled "Beautiful Night" in Vienna depicted an army bag with something inside. It was in such a bag that Melissa was found. However, clues were provided not only by John's paintings. Two poems represented something like a biographical description of his relationship with Melissa, and two hinted or even explicitly spoke of the girl's death. For example, one poem ended with the line, "When I die, perhaps we will become one whole," meaning that she had died, and he knew it for sure. Although the press dubbed John Swine as the Canal Killer, he considered himself a scalp hunter as he signed one of his works, an image of a man with a bloodied axe and a scalp with light hair. The hair most likely belonged to Delia, whom he dedicated the piece to, so to speak, wishing her to depart from life in the most painful way possible. The paintings depicting the murder of Paula were no less disturbing, and he continued to paint her even in prison. Although he was never tried for other murders, the police believe that John's drawings may contain clues to the identities of other victims, particularly two women whom the police have never been able to find. They did not find the other body parts of Melissa and Paula. Delia believes that John could have hidden them within the walls of the buildings he worked on as a carpenter. At least, that's what he did with his pet tarantula. On Monday, April 4, 2011, 54-year-old John was found guilty of the murders of Melissa and Paula. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Such a punishment is extremely rare in Britain, but the judge emphasized that Sweeney is too dangerous to ever be released again. It all started right where it ended, at St. Malachy's Church in Tyrone, Northern Ireland. In December 2010, beauty queen and teacher Michaela Hart and sports star John McCrime tied the knot, sharing their celebration with over 300 guests. However, just 3 weeks later, John returned with the body of his young wife, who was buried in her pristine wedding gown. What led to Michaela's death? Who could be so heartless and calculated as to take the life of a woman who had just begun to enjoy married life with her beloved? And will the collaborative efforts of multiple countries help uncover one of the most memorable and harrowing crimes of recent years? The captain of the Irish football team, John McCrime, and the daughter of one of the country's top football managers, Michaela Hart, met at university in 2005. It was love at first sight, and since then, the young couple had never been apart. During a vacation in Paris, John proposed to Michaela, and she happily accepted. They planned their wedding for New Year's Eve, on Michaela's 27th birthday. After the ceremonial wedding, the newlyweds boarded a plane, embarking on their 3-week honeymoon. They spent the first week in Dubai before the most anticipated part of their trip began, 2 weeks at the 5-star Legends Hotel, located in the fishing village of Grand Gauba on the northeast coast of Mauritius. Michaela chose Mauritius as their paradise island for the dreamy honeymoon and carefully researched local hotels. They settled on Legends Hotel due to its numerous positive reviews and popularity among tourists from Ireland. Upon arrival at the hotel, they asked the receptionist if they could be allocated one of their best rooms. They were informed that there was a vacant room in the luxury block, room 1025. January 10th, 2011, after having breakfast together, John decided to play golf while Michaela sunbathed. They met again for lunch. Michaela always enjoyed having tea with something delicious after lunch. She asked her husband to order tea while she went to the room to get Kit Kat bars with her favorite dark chocolate, which she had brought from Dubai and kept in the refrigerator. John offered to bring the treats for her, but it was only 150 steps from the restaurant to the room, so she went by herself. John took some photos and watched videos while waiting for his wife to return. After some time, he began to wonder why Michaela hadn't come back yet. He decided to look for her. Knocking on the door, John received no response. Since he had forgotten his key in the room, he peeked through the window but couldn't see anything, so he went to the receptionist. The corridor attendant led him back to the room and opened the door with his key. However, as soon as the corridor attendant took a few steps away from the door, he heard the cries of a man asking for immediate help. Upon entering the room, John discovered his wife in the bathtub filled with cold water. Bruises were visible on her neck, her skin was icy to the touch, and her lips had turned blue. Assuming that Michaela had intended to take a bath due to back pain but slipped or lost consciousness, John attempted to help her. However, his efforts were in vain. Within an hour, medical professionals pronounced Michaela's death, bringing an end to the dreams of a young and happy married couple. Presumably, due to the initial assumption of an unfortunate accident, nobody attempted to secure the crime scene, and people constantly entered and exited the newlyweds' room. The police were initially informed that a tourist had drowned, but upon entering the room and observing the state of Michaela's body and the disorder in the room, they suspected a murder had taken place. The distraught husband was taken to the police station and held for questioning for 5 hours. This was not unusual since most murders are committed by individuals close to the victims. What was abnormal in John's case was the cruelty and inappropriateness of the statements made by the police officers. Naturally, John couldn't hide his tears over the loss of Michaela. Just half an hour earlier, he had seen his wife happily walking towards their room, but now he discovered her lifeless body in the bathtub. However, upon seeing his tears, a police officer, perhaps trying to console him, said, "Why are you crying? You're still young. You'll find yourself a new wife." It is unknown how long they would have kept John at the station if it hadn't been for the hotel manager's intervention. The manager informed the police that the door of room 1025 had been opened with a stolen master key that fit all the locks. It became evident that the murder had been committed by someone from the hotel staff. It was likely an unintentional murder. Someone among the staff, possibly a security guard with access to the master key, entered the room at 2:42 p.m. 2 minutes later, Michaela opened her own door. The thief, possibly hiding in a small niche in the bathroom, had to quickly consider his options due to the unexpected presence of the maid. If his duties involved room cleaning, he could have simply smiled at Michaela, pretended to do his job, and nothing would have happened because it's a common situation in a hotel. However, if he was a security guard, he knew that his presence in the room would not be easily explainable. So, the only option he saw for himself was to hide in the bathroom and hope that the woman would simply leave. But that didn't happen. As investigators speculated, Michaela decided to take advantage of the opportunity and entered the bathroom. Inside, she encountered the thief. Michaela got scared and ran, and the thief, in panic, attacked her. Realizing that he had killed Michaela, he placed her in the bathtub. Perhaps he tried to create the appearance of an accidental incident with the maid. Despite the shock, he may have also thought that water would wash away any DNA evidence left on his victim. When John got up from the table at 3:05 p.m. and went to check why his wife was taking so long, the killer was still in the room. If John had his keycard with him, he could have caught the killer at the scene of the crime. However, by the time he went to the administrator, asked for the door to be opened, and entered the room. It was already 3:26 p.m., and the thief, unintentionally turned murderer, had vanished. Releasing John put the police under immense pressure. When a tourist is killed in a country that heavily relies on tourism, it becomes crucial to quickly solve the case. It seemed like the case would be solved promptly because the local police chief stated that the island had a 100% homicide clearance rate. One might think he was just acknowledging the efforts of his subordinates, but any professional would be suspicious considering that in 2011, besides Michaela, 30 other people were killed on the island, and all cases, except Michaela's, were solved based on confessions from suspects. The following year, the police once again solved all cases based on confessions. The fact that the police excessively relied on instinct and intuition, if it can be called that, could have been compensated by the fact that the investigators had an ideal crime scene. The hotel room was clean every day. Each entry into the room was recorded by the security system. Surveillance cameras were placed everywhere, and the hotel itself was practically an impregnable fortress, with vigilant security guards everywhere. As it will become clear shortly, that was not the case at all. Within 2 days of the murder, the police arrested several hotel employees, and 2 of them, Avinash Tribhuwan and Sandeep Mania, were charged with the murder while the others reluctantly became key prosecution witnesses. A week later, a hotel security guard named Dasan Narayanan was also arrested. Dasan was on duty on the day of the murder. His exact location at the time of the crime could not be confirmed, but his fingerprints were found on a fake key that the thieves used to replace the stolen universal key in the security room. Dasan couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation for how his DNA ended up on the safe door in the room. He admitted to touching Michaela's cheek when he rushed to help John, offering an explanation in advance for how his DNA could be present if it was found. However, despite Dasan's conflicting statements, the police decided to charge him only with being an accomplice to the thefts, focusing their main efforts on Avinash and Sandeep. On May 22, 2012, the trial began. The prosecution built its case primarily on the confession obtained by the police, following their customary practice. Prosecutors argued that when Michaela returned to the room on that day, she caught Avinash and Sandeep stealing money from the safe or her purse. Since hotel employees are often the main breadwinners for their families, not just immediate relatives, the thieves preferred to silence Michaela to avoid losing their jobs. During the trial, their colleague Raj Thikoy also testified. He was initially arrested but became the key prosecution witness and received immunity. Raj stated that he was near the room and heard the agonized cries of a woman but didn't knock on the door. Instead, he hid and saw the agitated and sweaty Avinash and Sandeep leave the newlyweds' room. Later, he asked what had happened, and they replied, "Nothing happened, just keep quiet. If you say anything, we'll involve you in this matter." In addition to witness testimonies, the prosecutors largely relied on the confession obtained from one of the suspects, Avinash Tribhuwan, following the customary police practices. Despite the fact that Sandeep and Avinash were the accused, it created an impression that the police themselves were being judged alongside them as they conducted a careless investigation. The defense attorneys drew attention to all the evident gaps, inaccuracies, and blatant errors made by the investigators. Firstly, after the discovery of Michaela's body, the hotel was not sealed off, and not a single guest or staff member was interviewed. Some tests were not conducted, while others were only performed after the hotel room was returned to the hotel's control, compromising the evidence. Fingerprints and palm prints were found in the room, but their owners were not identified. However, no DNA evidence indicating the guilt of Sandeep and Avinash was found. Even the paper currency, which according to the prosecutors interested the thieves, was not fingerprinted or examined for DNA. The court also heard that all the crime scene photographs were taken in black and white, and many important items were not photographed at all. But the biggest uproar was caused by the mystery of the 46 surveillance cameras capturing the events inside and around the hotel. Despite numerous requests, The police did not hand over the video recordings to the defense attorneys. It turned out that they did not withhold the footage because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. 90% of the videos were erased by the police officers who were unable to operate the cameras. When asked to demonstrate how the equipment works, instead of honestly answering yes, they simply pressed the button. It happened to be the record button, and when they thought they were playing back the recordings, they were actually erasing them. The glaring incompetence of the police made international media wonder if the local authorities were deliberately sabotaging the investigation. Finally, the accused claimed that they only made confessions after being subjected to torture by the police. Dasan Narayanan, who allegedly gave Sandeep the key card, claimed that he was forced to make the confession under threat of a weapon. Avinash also denied his statements, stating that the police tortured him and interrogated him with water, after which he vomited blood. Furthermore, he was allegedly told that his wife would be deported and he would be forced to live in Ireland with John McCrime, who would now need a new spouse. Avinash stated that he didn't even read his own confession because he simply signed the document that was presented to him. Another witness stated that he was forced to give false testimony, even though he and Sandeep were actually in room 1009 at the time of the murder, where a VIP client was supposed to stay, and Sandeep insisted on his subordinate maintaining perfect cleanliness in the room. At one point, he even grabbed the mop himself and demonstrated how the floors should be cleaned. Additionally, Sandeep claimed that he was on the phone with his sister in Britain at the time of the crime, which was corroborated by telecommunications data. Finally, the preserved surveillance camera footage also confirmed that he was in a different part of the hotel at the time of the murder. Overall, the court proceedings, which were expected to last for 2 weeks, dragged on for almost 8 weeks. This was largely due to the defense attorneys crossing the boundaries of decorum and turning the trial into a show. They constantly made jokes and elicited bursts of laughter among the bored onlookers and law students present in the courtroom. The defense raised the issue of there potentially being a sexual motive for the crime, hinting at the involvement of Michaela's husband. They referred to an intimate aid they found in the hotel room and insinuated possible misconduct between John and his wife. However, it turned out to be a simple insert from a women's magazine, Cosmopolitan, which Michaela had purchased at the airport. They then attempted to prove that John and Michaela had a severe argument, presenting a video that allegedly confirmed this. However, the individuals in the video were not Michaela and John, but rather 2 people resembling them from Germany. As a result, John had to contact this man on Facebook and request him to provide a statement at a police station in Germany, confirming that he was the one in the video. Overall, Michaela's family was incredibly distressed by the sensationalism surrounding the case of her murder. In particular, a local newspaper conducted a survey titled "Who Killed Michaela?" and John ended up ranking high on the list of the readers' votes. Additionally, the Mauritian newspaper published by the police the photos of Michaela's naked and bruised body, causing indescribable anguish to her family. Nevertheless, these 8 weeks came to an end, and it was time for the jury members to make their decision. The judge summarized the case, clearly pointing out the guilt of the suspects, leading Michaela's family to believe that it would give the accused the right to demand a review of the case after a guilty verdict. They had no doubt that the verdict would be exactly as they anticipated. Furthermore, the judge strongly advised the jury not to consider the impact this case would have on the country's image, but to make the right decision from their perspective. And after 2 months of trial, deliberating for only 2 hours, the jury declared Avinash and Sandeep innocent. After the acquittal verdict, John and Michaela's families were incredibly disappointed. They endured all the agony of the process, inappropriate remarks from attorneys and police, tolerated laughter in the courtroom, and even faced aggressive behavior from the locals because they were confident that the guilty parties would be punished for the murder. They were certain of Avinash and Sandeep's guilt and believed that they were acquitted because the case received global media attention, and the jurors did not want the murder case to reflect negatively on Mauritius' image. The Hart and McCavery families cannot forget that Avanash's lawyer appeared on a local radio station and essentially admitted his client's guilt, mentioning how Avanash cried and apologized to Michaela's family. The interview was supposed to be presented in court, but the lawyer managed to evade his responsibilities. John believes that Avanash told the truth when he confessed to Michaela's murder, and here's why. When anyone hears about death by strangulation, they imagine the killer choking the victim, gripping their neck with 2 hands. But Avanash recounted that when they were in the honeymoon suite, Michaela walked in and saw him holding a wallet. She asked what he was doing. She couldn't have known that Sandeep was in the bathroom. When the girl tried to prevent Avanash from leaving the room, standing in his way, Sandeep approached her from behind and wrapped one hand around her neck. The thing is, the autopsy report was compiled much later, and it confirmed that everything happened exactly as Avanash described. How could Avanash have invented such a method of strangulation if he didn't know it for sure? Additionally, Avanash mentioned that Michaela hit her head on the floor when she fell. The bruise on the back of her head, found during the autopsy, confirmed that as well. Furthermore, in summarizing the case, the judge reminded everyone that Avanash made his confession on January 12th and signed it on the 13th in the presence of his lawyer. If the police wanted to fabricate the confession, they would have forced Avanash to sign something else on the 12th. Moreover, the boy was examined by 3 doctors on different days, and none of them found any signs of torture on him. After the acquittal verdict, a new investigation was initiated. The police focused on a crucial piece of evidence, the keycard that the thief and murderer used to enter the room. However, even the mechanism of these locks cannot be trusted. The locks are not synchronized, and each of the 240 locks in the Legends Hotel shows its own time on the security systems panel, making it impossible to determine the exact time when the killer entered Michaela's room. As a result, the alibi of practically any suspect is in question because the exact time of the crime is unknown. To make matters worse, another significant loophole was found in the hotel's guest security. This loophole could increase the number of potential suspects from dozens to hundreds. If the hotel owns the guest rooms, restaurants, bars, golf courses, and similar areas, the beach is considered public property. According to Mauritian law, the island's beaches belong to the local residents, and fishermen and traders have always had full access to both the beach and the hotel's premises. Local traders sell their crafts to tourists, and young boys are accustomed to spending time on the hotel's grounds. In other words, despite the cameras, gates, and security personnel, the hotel is unable to provide complete protection of its premises, and there is no way to verify who had access to the honeymoon suite. As a result, the new investigation into the case also ended up with no significant breakthroughs. Under international pressure, the Mauritian police revisited Michaela's murder multiple times and even enlisted the services of a French laboratory for retesting DNA samples. In 2014, there was information about a breakthrough in the case when DNA found on Michaela's clothing matched the DNA of one of the suspects. However, this discovery was insufficient to warrant a new trial. In 2017, in an attempt to draw attention back to the case, John announced a substantial reward for information about the case. A few weeks after his return home, he received a call from a lawyer informing him that the arrests of Sandeep and Avanash were now inevitable. The lawyer did not specify the new evidence that made this possible, but Michaela's family felt relieved and believed that they would finally achieve justice. However, weeks and months passed, and no one was arrested. The case was officially closed in 2020, but in 2021, under pressure from Irish politicians, the Mauritian government agreed to reopen the case. The problem lies in the fact that the willingness to re-examine the case does not guarantee that it will be solved. Investigating any murder after 10 years is challenging, let alone considering the possibility that officials in Mauritius may lack the desire to find the killers. Over the course of 10 years, many investigators have climbed the career ladder, and if something is revealed in the case that many would prefer to bury, heads will roll. After the trial, John and Michaela's family filed a lawsuit against the hotel for 1.6 million euros. They settled the case out of court, and the details of the agreement are not disclosed, but the money went to a foundation established in Michaela's honor. Legends Hotel was renamed Lux Hotel and continues to enjoy immense popularity, as does Room 1025, which underwent renovations and was assigned the new number 1026. John, who now works as an accountant, met a pleasant girl named Cara Brennan at a memorial dinner for Michaela in 2013. Tara, also an accountant, received a marriage proposal from John in 2015. Last year, the couple welcomed their first child, James McCavery. Late spring of 1995, Aurora, 26 years old, and Mark, 32 years old, chose the beautiful Corsican island for their honeymoon. Aurora and Mark got married 2 months ago, and the girl picked this place for their first vacation together. The young wife wanted to explore Corsica, its mountains, villages, and picturesque landscapes. On that day, they stopped in the cozy little town of Calvi. Here, the newlyweds had a candlelit dinner in the harbor at a restaurant overlooking the bay. After dinner, Aurora and Mark headed towards the Notre Dame de la Serra Chapel. It is a popular spot among tourists where lovers go to enjoy the sunset, an ideal place for a romantic end to the day. Later in the evening, around 10:30, they got into the car to return to the hotel. The young couple had to drive on a very dangerous road that sharply descended. And right at the point where the railing ended, some animal suddenly jumped onto the road in front of the car. Mark quickly turned the wheel, and the car went off the cliff. Despite the extreme situation, Aurora didn't panic. She opened the door and jumped out of the car just before it fell. Mark wasn't as fortunate. He plummeted 140 meters along with the car. Aurora was in shock, but she was alive. She made a daring decision. In the middle of the night, in pitch darkness, she descended barefoot to help her husband. Aurora found Mark in the car and pulled him out. She dragged him by the legs towards the sea and washed his face. Then, the girl climbed back up the cliff to stop a passing car and called for help. The firefighters from Calvi 1 arrived at the scene. Aurora was in hysterics, screaming and crying that her husband was down there, with a head injury and unconscious. She begged the rescuers to descend as quickly as possible and save him. The firefighters immediately headed towards the base of the cliff to find Mark, but the darkness of the night and the uneven terrain significantly hindered their search. It took them half an hour just to locate the car. It turned out to be empty. However, they noticed a lot of blood and signs indicating that the man had a severe head injury. After several hours of relentless searching, the exhausted firefighters were ready to give up when, at 6 a.m., divers signaled that they had found something. Mark's body was floating in the water right next to the car at a depth of 3 meters. They brought his body to the surface. Unfortunately, it was too late for the newlywed. The police compiled a report on another unfortunate incident on that stretch of road and closed the case. Mark's body was transported to his native Belgium. The young widow was utterly devastated. She couldn't cope with the grief on her own, and she was hospitalized in a specialized clinic for several days. Mark's relatives rushed to console her, but she shut herself off from the world, declaring that she didn't want to see anyone. Mark's family understood her state of mind and didn't insist. After all, at the age of 26, she had lost her husband during their honeymoon. But in the following days, her behavior intrigued Mark's family more and more. Gradually, concern gave way to suspicion. Aurora insisted on having her husband cremated, but his parents vehemently opposed the idea. On the day of the funeral, she shocked the family even further by leaving the farewell ceremony earlier than expected. Since then, the relationship between her and Mark's family became increasingly complicated. Upon returning to the family home, she changed the locks and didn't even let her mother-in-law, who had come to collect a few of her son's inexpensive but sentimental belongings, inside. In the following weeks, Aurora put the house up for sale. The sale of the house provided her with a sum equivalent to 125,000 euros. But that wasn't all. It turned out she had received 7 insurance payouts after her husband's death. In total, Aurora received 475,000 euros. Shocked by such behavior from their daughter-in-law, the Van Ba couple decided to take legal action and filed a complaint regarding the suspicious death, prompting the coroner to demand an investigation into the circumstances of Mark's death. To understand what actually happened that evening, investigators began by studying the lives of the couple. Approximately a year before the incident, in April 1994, 31-year-old Mark Van Ba was working at a respected financial company in Brussels. He had a wonderful job, loving parents, and friendly colleagues, and it seemed like everything in his life was going well, or almost everything. However, he had not yet met a woman with whom he wanted to spend his life. Mark was at the age when he wanted to start a family. Mark and Aurora met at a bar in Brussels. At that time, Aurora was going from door to door selling ironing boards. It was not a very profitable job. The chemistry between Mark and Aurora was instant. Mark immediately fell in love with the beautiful girl and was crazy about her. The men's friends were envious and amazed by their vibrant relationship. Aurora was very attractive, fit, and sporty, while Mark was slightly overweight, not interested in sports, and quite shy. Yet, just a few weeks after their first meeting, Aurora moved in with Mark. The future husband's family warmly welcomed her, seeing that their son was happy with her and accepting her as their future daughter-in-law and the mother of their grandchildren. No one was surprised when the young couple decided to get married after a year. The girl set several conditions for her future husband, such as asking Mark to put half of the house in her name. This might have seemed unusual or inappropriate, but Mark, deeply in love, agreed to all of the bride's terms. On March 11, 1995, the young couple said yes to each other. The husband's entire family attended the wedding, while only the bride's twin sister was present from her side. Gradually, the husband's family began to notice that their daughter-in-law never talked about her family, evasively answering all questions about her relatives, her past, or her education. She pretended to come from a more privileged family than theirs. On September 5, 1996, more than a year after Mark's death, Aurora was invited to the police station for questioning. She confirmed the statements she had previously made. She and Mark had visited a restaurant in the port and then went to a chapel. On the way back, a wild animal suddenly jumped in front of their car. Mark turned the steering wheel, and an unfortunate accident occurred. Right before the car fell off the cliff, Aurora opened the door and jumped out. The police were unable to extract any further information from her. In an attempt to uncover the truth, Mark's body was exhumed on October 8, 1996. The forensic expert noted that some of the injuries were inflicted post-mortem. Numerous wounds were found on the body, but none were bleeding. This indicates that Mark died before the car fell off the cliff. The police wanted to question the widow again, but could not locate her anywhere. The detectives then decided to investigate the crime scene in Corsica. 2 years after the incident, Belgian police officers found themselves at the edge of the ravine where the newlyweds' car had plunged. Without the car, and armed only with photographs, the task became more challenging. Nonetheless, the expert was able to reconstruct the trajectory of the car before the fall. When something happens on the road, like an animal unexpectedly running out, a person reacts by turning the steering wheel but not by a full 90 degrees. If the car veered off the road, it should have fallen into the water, and under no circumstances could it have ended up where it was found. Additionally, the expert noticed another inconsistency with the accident theory. According to the firefighters who arrived at the scene, the bushes growing on the top of the cliff were crushed. If the car had quickly descended, the bushes would have been severed. The crushed vegetation indicated that the car had stayed on the bushes for some time before slowly rolling down. Furthermore, between the car and the water, after the incident, drops of blood were found that were unevenly distributed, suggesting that the body was carried, not dragged. Could Aurora, weighing less than 50 kilograms, have carried an 80 kilograms man. The findings of the investigation did not align with Aurora's version of events. The experts' conclusions were definitive. The car was pushed off the cliff. Now, the investigators wanted to understand what happened after the incident. Did Aurora descend to Healthmark? Did she find the strength and courage to climb down the rocks barefoot? As difficult as it may be to believe, it was possible. Aurora Martin was a champion rock climber, a trained athlete, so the police couldn't easily refute the possibility that she actually descended to help her husband. It was a dead end for them. Still having no news about the young woman, the investigators decided to delve deeper into her past. Who is she really? What secrets does she hide behind her evasive answers? In reality, the girl had a very difficult childhood where there was no place for a loving family or a proper education. When she was 12 years old, her parents divorced and her mother moved to Germany, and the daughter rarely saw her. She lived a carefree life with her father and 2 sisters. Her father was hardly involved in her life, and when the girl turned 18, she left her childhood home with grandiose dreams. Aurora wanted to become a model and participated in beauty contests, but without much success. So, she found work as a hostess in a bar, sometimes working as a model for an escort service. In February 1993, Aurora was 24 years old and lived life to the fullest, leveraging her beauty. One fine day, as usual, she went to a rock climbing club where a fateful encounter awaited her. Peter Schuett. He was rich, young, handsome, and shared her passion for mountaineering. He was 23 and she was 24. It was love at first sight. Next to Peter, Aurora was able to turn the page on her past life. This story seemed too miraculous to be true. Indeed, while investigating Peter's past, the investigators uncovered an unusual fact for a young man of his age. Peter Schmidt was a widower. His wife had died under suspicious circumstances. It happened 2 years prior when Peter turned 21 and was serving in the German army stationed in Belgium. Peter enjoyed frequenting clubs, and one evening, while hanging out with friends, he met a young student named Ursula Deschamps. Their romance was fast-paced, and within 3 months, Peter put a ring on her finger. However, Ursula quickly discovered that Peter couldn't be satisfied with just one woman. There were other surprises awaiting her. Ursula found large sums of cash and forged documents at their home. She wanted to report her findings to the police. Tensions grew in their young marriage, and they decided to get a divorce. But on the evening of August 29, 1992, Peter and Ursula got into a convertible and set off on a trip during which Peter was supposed to teach his wife how to drive. It was a strange outing for soon-to-be ex-spouses. Peter was behind the wheel and, as usual, driving very fast. He lost control, and the car plunged into a canal at high speed. Peter managed to escape in time but couldn't save his wife, who drowned along with the car. He recalled that he even touched her hand and couldn't hold onto her to pull her to the surface. Ursula's body was found several days later. The autopsy revealed nothing that would cast doubt on the fact that the girl drowned. The police reconstructed the crime scene, and Peter convincingly demonstrated how he had escaped from the car through the rear window. Ursula's family, however, never believed it was an unfortunate accident. Firstly, it was a convertible, and Peter had never lowered the top before. Secondly, Ursula was an excellent swimmer. According to an expert who later analyzed the case, Ursula had time to escape from the car as drowning doesn't occur instantly but takes around 3 minutes as the water fills the vehicle. However, the Belgian police treated it as an unfortunate accident caused by the negligence of the driver. The young widower was sentenced to 3 months in prison, and the case was closed. 2 cases, 2 crime scenes, and 2 scenarios between which investigators couldn't help but notice coincidences. In both cases, there was a road accident, the driver lost control, and the car ended up in the water. One of the spouses managed to escape from the car in time, while the body of the other was not found in the car.
Now detectives urgently needed to find Aurora and Peter, as they became the main suspects in the case of Mark Vanber's death. Detectives also suspected Peter of Ursula's murder, but since Peter had served 3 months in connection with that case, it was possible to forget about prosecuting him again for the same crime. Meanwhile, the police learned
Why Ursula probably died and why Peter became so wealthy. After his wife's death, he received an insurance payout equivalent to 115,000 euros. This allowed him to leave the army and seduce the beautiful Aurora. Their romance lasted for a year. But in early 1994, for unknown reasons, the young couple separated. It was during this time that the girl registered with a marriage agency. She described the ideal man as wealthy, with his own apartment, not overweight, and pleasant. April 1994 marked the beginning of her relationship with Mark Vanber. 4 months after their meeting in August 1994, the girl insured Mark. Interestingly, Mark was obviously unaware of this because the documents bore not his signature, but Aurora claimed that his hand was injured, and she signed the documents for him. Soon, an unfortunate incident occurred. Aurora sold the house, received the insurance payout, and disappeared. However, she didn't stay hidden for long. 2 months after Mark's murder, investigators found her trace in Luxembourg. She opened a bank account to deposit an amount equivalent to 475,000 euros. 2 individuals had access to the account, herself and a certain Peter Schlitt. The two reunited and moved to Miami, Florida. For almost 2 years, the lovers lived a life of luxury. Luxurious apartments, cars, and a yacht. Until a major French newspaper published an article calling them diabolical lovers and described the suspicions the police had against them. Aurora and Peter became extremely cautious. They changed their appearance and only made calls from telephone booths. They managed to hide for some time until Peter was arrested in a supermarket parking lot. He had around $50,000 with him and offered it to the police in exchange for his release, but they refused. 2 days later, the police arrested Aurora in the apartment where the lovers were hiding. Peter and Aurora did everything possible to avoid extradition. However, on December 3, 1998, they were returned to Belgium. Aurora immediately refused to give any testimony. Peter, on the other hand, spoke a lot, but little of what he said was true. Since they clearly did not want to cooperate with the investigation, the police did not have solid evidence against them. The course of the case changed due to an anonymous phone call. A woman called and revealed that she had information about Mark's murder. Later, the police identified the woman as Fabienne Lefebvre. Fabienne was Aurora's stepmother, but she had recently separated from the girl's father and decided to either seek revenge or clear her conscience. Fabienne claimed that after the tragedy in Corsica, she rushed to the hospital to comfort her stepdaughter. However, she was met by a completely different girl, not grieving at all. According to Fabienne, Aurora confessed everything to her. She stated that Peter was behind it all and that he took care of everything. When Aurora and Mark were driving on the road, Peter and 3 accomplices, his friends from Germany, stopped the car. They beat Mark with baseball bats. According to Fabienne, Mark never knew until the end who betrayed him because he begged the men to spare his wife and let her go. When the beating was over, they put Mark's body in the car and pushed it off a cliff. However, the police failed to find the accomplices or prove their existence because it didn't match Peter's character. Additionally, there were many doubts about the truthfulness of Fabienne's words. Firstly, Fabienne and Aurora had a strained relationship, and secondly, why didn't she go to the police earlier and why did she make an anonymous call? The woman claimed that she was afraid. However, the police were convinced that building a solid case based solely on Fabienne's words was not possible and sought other evidence. In Germany, the police found postcards from Corsica and photographs of the crashed car that went off the cliff in the possession of one of Peter's brothers. They were souvenir snapshots, But the intriguing part was that they were taken 6 months before Mark's murder. Was it a coincidence or careful preparation? Despite the fact that 4 years had passed since the murder, the details of the crime remained a mystery. On June 16, 1999, the police decided to reconstruct the crime scene at the airport. The driver was driving the car at a speed not exceeding 35 kilometers per hour. Aurora was supposed to open the car door wide, as if trying to jump out. She failed to do so, even when the car significantly reduced its speed. She became angry, cried, and had hysterical outbursts, trying to find an explanation for her failure. Peter intervened, attempting to defend Aurora. It is unclear why he was participating in the reconstruction at all, since theoretically he was not present during the crime in Corsica. After this experiment, the investigators were convinced that Mark Vanber did not die as a result of an accident but was murdered. The trial began. The defendant's lawyers proposed a new version of events. Allegedly, Mark suffered a heart attack just before falling from a height. In other words, he died a few seconds before the accident, and therefore all the injuries he sustained afterwards became post-mortem. This was a hypothesis that could undermine the entire theory of prosecution. Even the forensic expert considered it a clever move, but such a version did not correspond to the autopsy results. Furthermore, during the trial, the forensic expert revealed another extremely important detail. Mark hadn't eaten anything for several hours before the crime. He was hungry. The fact that Aurora even lied about the romantic dinner with her husband that evening was the final straw for the jurors. They found both of them guilty. Aurora was sentenced to 15 years and Peter to 20 years. It is unlikely that they served even half of their sentences. They were released long ago. Despite Peter being deported to Germany and Aurora being prohibited from leaving the country, as of 2021, they were still together. Peter found work as a carpenter, and thanks to her fluency in several languages, Aurora works. The most remarkable thing about this case is that Aurora and Peter committed 2 almost perfect murders. And the second crime would undoubtedly have gone unnoticed if Aurora had been a little more patient and hadn't slammed the door in front of her husband's family. If she had remained the same pleasant girl they knew, she would have calmly left after a few months, and the Vanber family would never have suspected her of anything. Larry Riskin joined the Navy after school, and over the years of service, he achieved the rank of commanding officer in the Navy fleet. He participated in the Persian Gulf War and demonstrated courage and bravery multiple times, but unexpectedly discovered that he was taking orders from a fragile woman. Larry met Sonia Rios at a barbecue. She owned a beauty salon in the city of Lomita, a suburb of Los Angeles. He was immediately attracted to the very beautiful and striking woman, and within a year, Sonia took her husband's family name and became Sonia Riskin. They settled in Sonia's house. Larry was always extremely close to his family, parents, brothers, and especially his younger sister Sherry Jackson. But everything changed with the arrival of Sonia. She did not allow him to see his relatives, inventing various reasons why they couldn't visit them in Washington. The relationship deteriorated to the point that Larry didn't communicate with his sister and brothers for over 10 years. They only heard rumors that he had resigned and found a job as a teacher for children with special needs. His colleagues remember that he loved children and adored his job. However, he confessed that he was unhappy at home. One thing weighed heavily on him. He dreamed of becoming a father. However, Sonia did not want to have children, and being a very beautiful woman, she misled Larry, pretending to be younger than him. In reality, she was 16 years older. Of course, women at that age are still capable of having children, but Larry felt that his chances of fulfilling his dream were diminishing with each passing day. That's why he grasped at the last straw. In Sonia's homeland, the Philippines, he became attached to his wife's brother's grandchildren, Quincy and Jetmark. The parents of the teenagers believed that with Sonia and Larry in the USA, their children would have a better future, so they supported Larry's proposal to adopt them. Sonia did not object. but insisted on taking care of all the legal matters herself. A year passed, 2, 3, but the process of adoption was not progressing. Larry discovered that Sonia was intentionally sabotaging the adoption process. At that moment, it was his last chance to create a complete family, and he was very disappointed. So much so that he demanded a divorce. Sonia agreed, but with one condition. She asked her husband to go to the Philippines and sell her family business, a taxi company, a matter that needed to be resolved immediately. The man agreed, partly because he wanted to see the children, especially since Quincy's 16th birthday was approaching. Surprisingly, Sonia did not go, even though the matter concerned her family and her business. Before his visit to the Philippines, the first in 13 years, Larry visited his relatives in Washington. He was happy to start a new chapter in his life without his wife but with her nephews, whom he still hoped to adopt. Immediately after landing, Larry went to see them. During the birthday party, Larry noticed that the little cousin of the boys had developed an eye infection. He insisted on taking her to the hospital. Someone present made a call to Sonia and informed her that they would be at the hospital. Larry put the girl in the car and, along with Jetmark and a few other adults, they all went to the hospital. After the visit to the doctor, they got back into the Jeep and were about to return home when a motorcycle approached them. One of the two men on the motorcycle started shooting at Larry's head and abdomen. Then the criminals quickly fled the scene. Jetmark tried to help Larry and called for help. He was confident that they would save him since the hospital was only a few steps away. But the boy was mistaken. They couldn't save Larry. He was 43 years old. When Sonia was informed of her husband's murder, she completely lost control. She was shaking all over and needed help from neighbors Nicole and Jim Thompson to calm her down. Nicole called Larry's sister, Sherry, to inform her about what had happened, but unexpectedly, Sherry started blaming Sonia for everything. Nicole and Jim didn't take her words seriously. Not then. However, the next morning, Sonia asked Jim again to come and help her search for documents. When Jim learned that Sonia was looking for her husband's insurance policy, he refused to help her. While Larry's family was preparing for his funeral, his wife was only interested in the insurance. Moreover, Sonia had no intention of attending the funeral. She arranged for her husband to be cremated, and the urn with his ashes remained in the Philippines with one of her relatives. Larry's relatives saw this as another blow from Sonia, but they still held the funeral and prepared a niche in the mausoleum, where they hoped to someday place the urn with his ashes. They hoped that the Philippine police would solve this case, confident that Larry's wife was behind it all. But at that time, they still didn't know, nor could they have known, that there was another mystery in this story, another man, and another murder. It was news that had the impact of a bomb exploding. Larry Riskin was not Sonia's first husband, and the reason why they were no longer together with her first husband was that he was killed in the Philippines 19 years ago. The man's name was Earl John Bordeaux. Earl's family lived in Davenport, Iowa, in the same house where he grew up. He was the pride of the family. Earl joined the Navy during the Vietnam War, but his unit was stationed in the Philippines, where he met an attractive local girl named Sonia, who sang at a nightclub near their base. It was obviously love at first sight because the young couple quickly got married, and a few months later, Earl brought his young wife home to meet his family. However, the happy reunion did not go well. The girl did not please Earl's family. Therefore, after his departure from the Navy, they settled in Southern California. Several years later, Sonia opened a beauty salon, and her husband found work in a bakery. Outwardly, it seemed like a family filled with love and harmony. But in reality, Sonia enjoyed giving orders to her military husband and controlled him as she pleased. They lived together for more than 20 years when Earl finally realized that such a family life and his wife's commands were burdening him. Sonia agreed to divorce. But before that, and here a strange sense of déjà vu arose, the husband needed to go to the Philippines to sell the family taxi motor company. Earl didn't want to go, but his wife was inflexible on this issue, and the man chose not to argue. He pleaded with his younger brother Dennis to go with him, but he couldn't quickly obtain a passport, so Earl went to the Philippines alone. It was a hot August night when Earl's plane landed in Manila. He arrived at the house where his wife's relatives lived around midnight. The man was exhausted from the journey, fell onto the couch, and fell into a deep sleep until he was truly killed. When the police arrived, they found Earl lying in a pool of his own blood. He had been shot. The officers concluded that a robber had entered the house and Earl had interfered, but there were no signs of forced entry, nothing was stolen, and the criminal only fired at Earl. 3 men were immediately arrested and charged with the murder. Later, 2 more were detained. They were all members of Sonia's family. Fresh human blood was found on the shirt and pants of one of Sonia's brothers. There was enough evidence to send the culprits to prison for a long time. But then came a surprise. Since Sonia was the closest relative, according to Philippine law, she was supposed to attend a preliminary hearing in court where charges would be brought against her family members. However, since she didn't show up, the charges were dropped and the case was closed. The local authorities claimed their hands were tied, at least officially. Unofficially, the locals gossip that Sonia paid to make all the problems go away. As they explain it, $1,000, and the witnesses would stay silent and the evidence would disappear. Earl's brother, Dennis, felt guilty because he let his brother go alone, so he constantly called a lawyer in the Philippines, spending thousands of dollars on his own investigation, hoping to make Sonia worried. But instead, he became the target himself. He received around 200 threats over the phone, but he didn't calm down. He reported Sonia to the police and the FBI. As a result, he became the target of the killer. It happened once while he was fishing. The shooter missed, but it didn't end there. Later, the attack happened right near his garage. Dennis informed the FBI about everything, but nothing happened. The Bordeaux case was forgotten until, after 10 years, Dennis learned that Sonia had a second husband, and he suffered the same fate as his brother. Dennis hoped that the renewed interest in Sonia could also revive interest in his brother's case. Once learning Sonia's plans to obtain not only all the property but also her husband's insurance, things didn't go as planned. The insurance company hired a private investigator who quickly discovered that fraud was nothing new for Sonia. She had burned down her beauty salon for insurance purposes, manipulated taxes and receipts. She had been caught twice before, so her name was known to the police. The investigator provided his report to the employer, and the insurance company refused to pay Sonia the insurance money. However, the investigator's work impressed Sherry and her family so much that they hired him to investigate the murders. He quickly found out that Earl's and Larry's murders were similar in that the Sony brothers were involved in both crimes. They, like other family members, were financially dependent on Sonia and were willing to do anything she demanded. Sherry, just like Dennis, handed everything the private investigator found to the FBI, hoping that an investigation would finally begin. However, weeks and months passed and nothing changed. Sonia continued working at her salon as usual. But after the new year, Sherry started receiving emails. The author claimed that Sonia was responsible for Larry's murder and offered to return his sister's ashes. The emails were signed by John Bordeaux. How could that be? Bordeaux was the surname of Sonia's first husband, but Earl John Bordeaux had long been dead. It turns out that Sonia had a son whose existence she kept secret. She gave birth to a boy in the Philippines when she was a very young girl, a teenager. Earl adopted the boy after their wedding. Earl's family knew nothing about him, nor did Larry's family, despite Larry's desperate desire to have children. Nevertheless, Sherry decided to respond to the emails, primarily because she wanted to return Larry's ashes. John asked for $35,000 in return, but the more they corresponded, the more Sherry became afraid of what kind of person he might be. What if he was a fraud or something worse? With each new letter, she realized that he was indeed worse. For an additional fee, he offered another service to kill Sonia, whom Sherry despised. Sherry was frightened, not knowing how to escape this situation and fearing what else might happen. Her fears were not unfounded. On April 27, 2007, in Lomita, the 60-year-old owner of a beauty salon was found murdered. She had been shot, and the killing resembled an execution rather than a random shooting. The victim was Sonia Riskin, known as the Black Widow of Lomita, who was suspected of killing not one, but two husbands. She met the same fate as her victims. The arriving police were struck by the meticulous and well-kept nature of the house. It appeared that the owner rarely received visitors during her lifetime, which perfectly matched her character as a reclusive and suspicious woman. It was also interesting to note that there were no signs of forced entry. It seemed that the killer simply entered the house and shot his victim. Her purse remained untouched, along with the cash inside. The neighbors saw nothing. The victim's relatives immediately rushed to the scene, among them her beloved nephew, Eric de la Cruz. Sonia regarded him as her favorite grandson and was proud of him. The young man served on the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier and had just returned home after a tour of Asia. Upon hearing that his beloved aunt had been killed, he immediately informed the police that if something happened to Sonia, John Bordeaux was responsible for it all. John Bordeaux didn't have to be searched for, as he was the one who found Sonia's body and contacted the rescue service. The detectives immediately found the relationship between the son and Mother Strange. There wasn't a single photograph of him in the house, no hint of a son, as if he didn't exist for Sonia. Overall, he seemed like the family outcast, especially compared to Sonia's favorite, Eric. John explained that although he and his mother sometimes couldn't find common ground and didn't communicate, the situation had improved recently, and he would never harm her. When asked who he believed could have committed the murder, he could only mention Sherry, Larry's sister. After all, she genuinely hated Sonia, as did Dennis. The FBI questioned both of them, but they had alibis. Moreover, no one was as devastated by Sonia's death as these two. They hoped Sonia would pay for her terrible actions by going to prison, so the detectives turned their attention back to John. The electronic emails signed with his name didn't work in his favor. Furthermore, he failed the polygraph test. Even his own relatives considered him the murderer. Allegedly, no one else had the motive, opportunity, and means to commit the crime, but he insisted on his innocence and stood his ground. Therefore, the detectives didn't rush to arrest him, and they were rewarded with a clue from the Black Widow herself. A few days before Sonia's death, she contacted the police to report two strange incidents at her beauty salon. The first time, a young man appeared at her hairdressing salon wanting a haircut. He called her from the parking lot, and Sonia saw him through the window. She became suspicious because he had a short, military-style haircut. It was clear he didn't need a haircut, so she told him that she only served regular clients, which he wasn't. It seemed like the incident was resolved, but 2 days later, the same guy returned to the salon and this time acted more aggressively. He opened fire on Sonia, causing her to panic and call the police. She informed the officers that she didn't know the shooter, but she remembered he had called her 2 days ago. The cautious woman recorded his number. It belonged to a certain Fernando Romero. Romero himself had disappeared, but the detectives only needed a warrant to access the history of his calls. They expected the phone to lead them to John Bordeaux, but no, his number wasn't listed. Instead, they found the number of someone they knew well. A person who had communicated with Fernando not once or twice, but frequently, especially in the hours before and after the murder. The number belonged to Sonia's beloved nephew, Eric de la Cruz. Further on, after a week, the news reached the FBI. Specialists were investigating the IP addresses from which the supposed letters from John Bordeaux were sent. All of them led to Asia, Hong Kong, Korea. These addresses belonged to naval bases. The FBI employees knew that Eric and Romero were two sailors who served on an aircraft carrier. It was likely that they knew each other. Could these young individuals have planned the murder while being on an American military ship? The FBI investigated the location of the ship during the time the emails were sent. It was in ports in Hong Kong, Japan, and South Korea at the same time the letters were sent. However, sending letters is one thing, but why would Eric kill a woman who cared for him better than his own son? Sonia was killed late in the evening on Friday, and on Monday morning, even before the office opened, Eric was already waiting for her lawyer. He wanted to know how much money he would inherit from his beloved aunt. However, Sonia had another card hidden up her sleeve. Eric didn't receive a cent. All her money, homes, cars, absolutely all of Sonia's belongings were left to her son, Jean Bordeaux. But the young man had another harsh blow awaiting him. It turned out that all this time, while he believed he was the main suspect of the police, Jean Bordeaux was being misled. And when the investigators simply presented him with a photograph of Fernando Romero, Eric lost his ability to speak. Choking on surprise and stumbling over his words, he blurted out that he had conducted his own investigation and Fernando had nothing to do with it. He must have realized that Fernando was the thread leading the investigation back to himself. Both young individuals were arrested and charged with the murder of Sonia Riskin. The police apologized to John for pressuring him. He was still frightened after what he had to endure, but he understood that the detectives were just doing their job. In February 2011, the trial began. Fernando and Eric were tried together. The prosecution faced a difficult task. The victim of the murder herself was suspected of orchestrating the killings of two husbands. The accused, the young sailors, could elicit sympathy and comparison. The prosecutor decided to be honest with the jury. He portrayed her as a cold-blooded killer deserving punishment, but now it was necessary to punish the defendants who not only killed a woman but also attempted to frame her son. It worked. The jury found the two guilty. They were sentenced to imprisonment ranging from 26 years to life. It was an astonishing family. They eliminated anyone in their path of financial gain. Sonia and her brothers killed Earl. Sonia and her brothers killed Larry. And Eric killed his beloved aunt. How many murders can there be in one family if it's not a Game of Thrones? The irony lies in the fact that Sonia killed two people who did nothing wrong and were always kind to her. Eric killed a person who had always been kind to him for the sake of money he never received. The Black Widow of Lamata truly reaped what she sowed. In 2019, Sherry went to the Philippines to personally try to find Larry's remains. She could only ascertain that the remains were passed from one relative to another under Eric's orders. In the end, her search led her to a house that had obviously been vacant for a long time. She couldn't fulfill her dream of returning with her brother's urn to their homeland. The meeting went well. Janine smiled satisfactorily. She was sitting in the car with her friend Becky and a new acquaintance introduced to her by Becky. Janine was facing difficulties with her rapidly growing real estate business, and the man was supposed to help her. They met in the car due to the busy schedule of the women and to drive by and discuss one of the houses owned by Janine's real estate agency. They agreed on everything, and Janine was sure that the rough patch would soon be over. She would go on a cruise, and when she returned, work would fall into place, and she would receive $1 million, which she would put into new projects. Smiling happily in anticipation of change, Janine opened the car door and stepped out into the parking lot. But before she could take a few steps, she realized that none of her dreams were meant to come true. Janine Lee Monsell, 28, met Max Jones, 31, in early 1991. It was a fateful encounter. Until then, Janine had been desperately unlucky in love. She had been married twice before and was raising a son on her own. But with Max, everything was different. He was reliable and faithful, and they immediately developed feelings for each other. It only took them a few months to decide that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. Janine and Max's wedding took place quite modestly in a local church in October of the same year, 1991. Soon after, their family began to grow. The following summer, their son Zach was born, and 2 years later, their daughter Alexandria, who everyone called Alex, arrived. The family lived modestly, but they managed to make ends meet. Janine tried several jobs. She tried working as a nurse and selling various goods, but her job failures were offset by her husband's stable income. Max was not only talented, but also hardworking as a carpenter. His skills were highly valued, and he was never idle. Moreover, he never turned down extra work, and although the family didn't live extravagantly, they stayed afloat. The couple lived in a modest house in Northport, Florida, where they raised their children, attended church, and participated in the local community. They had many friends, were loved and respected by their neighbors, and seemed genuinely happy together. But soon, the situation took a sharp turn. In 1997, Janine got a job as a guard in a prison, but it led to a huge scandal. She engaged in a romantic relationship with an inmate, and after someone complained about their relationship, they were caught in the act, so to speak. Their prolonged affair was confirmed when letters from Janine to her lover were found in the inmate's cell. Though they were signed with a different name, it wasn't hard to establish their true author. To prevent further scandal and numerous interrogations, Janine resigned. But secrets are hard to keep, and rumors quickly reached her husband. Janine and Max had a falling out. It was a double blow for Max. Firstly, his wife had been unfaithful to him. Secondly, she had once again lost a job that provided a decent supplement to the family, which was barely making ends meet financially. The couple decided not to split up for the sake of their children, but trust was lost forever. They tried to pretend that everything was still the same, but longtime friends saw through the facade. It was just for show. One of the close individuals to the family was John Chamberlain. He met the couple at church, and since then, the two hard-working men, Max, working as a carpenter, and John, a locksmith, became best friends. Over the years, John observed how the spouses drifted apart. Janine and Max lived together, but besides their children and property, they had nothing in common. But gradually, even though love had long vanished from their relationship, the situation more or less stabilized. The children grew up, and each of the spouses socialized with their own circle of friends. In 2011, Max began to suffer from stomach problems, which led to a significant weight loss and multiple hospitalizations. However, doctors were at a loss and couldn't find the cause of his illness. Prior to this, he had never complained about health issues. The family did everything possible to alleviate Max's condition, hoping that doctors would soon understand what was wrong. But they were completely unprepared for how it would all end. Just 3 days after Thanksgiving in 2011, the family found Max near death. He was lying in bed, pale and unresponsive. Janine called 911. The dispatcher instructed her on how to administer first aid to Max, and Alexandria followed the instructions. Unfortunately, Max passed away in his daughter's arms. Paramedics arrived minutes later, but they couldn't do anything to help. Max died from a heart attack at the age of 52. Family and friends were shocked by his sudden death. They knew he was ill, but they thought it was related to his stomach. The news of the heart attack came as a thunderbolt out of the blue. It was very difficult for Zach and Alexandria, who were 19 and 17 years old respectively, to cope with the loss of their father. Nevertheless, a doctor signed the death certificate, and Max was cremated 2 days later. Now, it was up to Janine to provide for the family. Considering her previous employment difficulties, it seemed like an insurmountable task for her. But to everyone's surprise, she not only managed but also significantly improved the family's financial situation. Of course, a big help was the $1 million insurance payout she received after her husband's death. But she didn't just sit on it. Using the money, she opened a real estate agency and began renovating and renting out homes. Like many cities in the USA, Northport experienced a real estate boom in the early 2000s. But the 2008 crisis hit the real estate sector hard, and many homes were foreclosed by banks. They stood abandoned, waiting for new owners. These homes became an opportunity for someone like Janine, who had the money to take advantage of the situation. Naturally, Janine also found herself and her children a better place to live. Explaining her actions by the need to move on, she sold the house and all of her late husband's belongings, including his musical and work tools, which he cherished dearly. But it didn't stop there. She began spending a lot of time with her new friend Becky. She drank, used drugs, and spent money on travels, cars, and even a second home in the Great Smoky Mountains area in Tennessee. To those who knew her behavioral changes seemed astonishing. It seemed strange to acquaintances that one could forget a husband with whom Janine had spent 20 years so quickly. Finally, changes awaited Janine in her personal life as well, when she met Matthew Riley Smith, a cable television installation technician. Matthew was only 26 years old. He was half Janine's age and only a few years older than her son. Nevertheless, in July 2012, Janine announced to everyone that she and Matthew had married during a recent trip to Las Vegas. Zach and Alexandria didn't like that their mother had remarried so hastily, especially considering that Max had passed away less than a year ago. They tried not to conflict with Matthew because he hadn't done anything wrong to them, but they disapproved of their mother's eagerness to move on so quickly. Nevertheless, Matthew Smith became a part of Janie Ain's personal life and business, but Matthew's help turned out to be insufficient. In fact, the business was so successful that Janine soon needed an employee, and she turned to her old friend, John Chamberlain. Besides being a locksmith, he had many other skills necessary for home repairs. Janine offered John a job with the condition that he and his 11-year-old daughter would live in one of her houses and pay a very low rent. It was a lucrative offer, and John agreed. Everything went well for a few months, but soon doubts began to creep into the man's mind. John Chamberlain was particularly troubled by the number of houses where all his work involved drilling the lock on the front door. Janine reassured him that this was just a routine part of the job. Since the houses had been empty for a long time, there was no way to contact the previous owners and obtain keys. But John wasn't satisfied with this explanation. Nevertheless, he continued to do repairs for Janine, not taking any action, until one significant moment. His worst fears were confirmed when he answered a call from one of Janine's tenants. The tenant told him that a stranger had just knocked on their door and inquired about what they were doing in his house. To get to the bottom of the situation, John gave the tenant Janine's personal number. Within minutes, she called him back and was furious. John told her that if she was involved in something illegal, he didn't want to be a part of it. In response, she ordered him to vacate the house and sent Matt to deliver the message in person. The encounter between the men ended in a fight. Janine sent John an eviction notice, but he refused to leave, and the matter went to civil court. Additionally, John went to the police. He met with detectives and told them about his involvement in Janine's business, which he believed to be illegal. They listened carefully and said they believed his suspicions. This encouraged him to also share suspicions about the death of Max Jones. Despite Max's stomach problems, his heart attack came as a surprise, and it seemed that Janine wasn't grieving at all. She had remarried a younger man and was living a luxurious lifestyle. But what troubled him the most was that Janine had cremated Max within 2 days of his death without allowing an autopsy, and she found no better way to deal with Max's ashes than to hand the urn to John. Thanks to John Chamberlain's tip-off, the police began monitoring Janine, hoping to learn more about her suspicious business and the death of her third husband. And the police found something. Although Janine and Matt were renovating and renting out properties, they had no connection to any of these houses. They hadn't purchased them or obtained ownership rights to rent them out. Janine would go to the tax assessor's office and file documents formally renouncing her rights to the properties, but with a forged signature. Considering she was renovating and spending large sums of money on the houses, who wouldn't believe they belonged to her? All that was left was to drill the locks, tidy up the house a bit, and it could be rented out. She deceived unsuspecting people out of tens of thousands of dollars, and she even gave them a prepaid phone number to avoid leaving any traces to her. So she was enraged when Jon gave the tenants her real phone number. Her business was a scam from start to finish. Furthermore, Janine didn't have a license to work as a realtor. But that was just the beginning of the investigation. The screws were tightening around Janine, and she made a desperate attempt to get free. Although it's unknown for certain if Janine knew that Jon had gone to the police, she decided that the legal proceedings with him posed enough of a threat to her business to take action. Whom did she decide to turn to with her problem? Of course, to her best friend Becky. She told her that Jon was too informed about her affairs, and the court proceedings were costing her too much money. So, they needed to deal with him. Becky promised to help. She had acquaintances, not always acting within the law, and one of them could help solve this sensitive issue. On February 20th, 2013, Becky and Janine met for lunch at a restaurant to discuss the details. They needed to make sure they understood their plan before Becky introduced her friend to her acquaintance. During lunch, Janine described Jon Chamberlain's appearance, gave his address, and even drew a schematic of the house on a napkin with indications of the best points from which to enter. Janine insisted that the matter needed to be resolved as quickly as possible. She planned to go on a cruise and wanted to ensure she wasn't in town during the murder to have an alibi. Becky promised to pass the information to the hitman, and 5 days later organized a meeting with him. On February 25th, Becky and Janine met with the executor, got into his car, and discussed the final details. Janine handed the man a photo of Jon Chamberlain and said it would be preferable to break his neck to keep the crime scene clean. In the worst case, he could be shot. The main thing was to get rid of the body. As she added, if the body can't be found, nothing can be proven. They drove past Jon's house where she explained how to break in and warned about any possible threats, such as the man's 11-year-old daughter. Waving her hand, she stated that the girl didn't concern her, and if she got in the way, they should deal with her too. The important thing was that her body wasn't found either. The driver stopped the car in the parking lot and at some point asked Becky to step out of the car to discuss the final details of the matter alone with Janine. As if the random victim in the form of an 11-year-old girl wasn't horrifying enough, by the end of the meeting, Janine made another chilling proposition. She asked if she could get 2 for the price of 1. She was tired of her 4th husband, Matthew Smith, and wished to rid herself of the burden and threat. Just on January 3rd, his life insurance policy worth $1 million came into effect, and he would be more useful to her dead than alive. Janine proposed getting rid of him a couple of weeks after Jon. But in his case, it was harder to accomplish because he might have a weapon on him, and there were surveillance cameras in the house. She suggested staging his murder as a carjacking. The killer agreed to all her terms, and she agreed to pay $4,000 for each man. She brought $1,000 with her, ready to hand it over immediately to confirm her seriousness of intentions. When the meeting was over, a satisfied Janine got out of the car. Seconds later, she was surrounded by police officers and arrested. Her initial fear and shock quickly turned to anger as she realized she had fallen into a classic police trap. For the past few weeks, she had been the subject of an investigation under the codename Black Widow, and it was all because Jon wasn't the only one who went to the police. Janine's best friend, Becky, was also cooperating with the detectives. While she did have connections in the city's underworld, she chose to take a different path. An informant called the police, reporting that his friend wanted to report a planned contract killing. This friend turned out to be Becky. When they were discussing the murder details in the restaurant and Janine was drawing the victim's house plan, Becky had a microphone and camera on her. In the car, she introduced Janine to Officer Dominic Harris, who of course recorded the entire conversation. The man needed Janine to do several things that would later help convict her. He needed Janine to provide a photo of Jon Chamberlain. She had to show where he lived. She had to say how she wanted him to be killed. They needed to discuss the cost of the hit. He needed Janine to give money for the murder. The man played his role perfectly, even though it was difficult for him to hide his shock and disgust when Janine casually dismissed Jon's daughter as a nuisance and later talked about Matt's murder. Janine was charged with 2 counts of solicitation to commit murder and faced 33 charges related to her business, ranging from robbery to criminal use of personal information and operating as a realtor without proper authorization. Her husband, Matt Smith, was horrified when he was told that his wife had planned to have him killed. He himself was arrested on March 15, 2013. Initially, he was reluctant to cooperate, but the 30 charges of fraud persuaded Matt, and he offered to testify against Janine. In exchange for his testimony against his wife, he was offered a great deal. In January 2014, after spending 6 months in prison, he pleaded guilty to only 1 charge. He was sentenced to 4 years of probation and ordered to pay $17,500 to the victims of their scam. However, Matt never got to testify in court. In May 2014, Janine announced that she didn't want to contest the charge. This means that she doesn't admit guilt, but is willing to accept the punishment that the judge will impose. Janine claimed that her impulsive decision to hire a hitman was influenced by drugs and alcohol, and that she was not a danger to society. However, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Of course, the police tried to investigate her involvement in the death of Max Jones. When John Chamberlain approached the police, they listened carefully to him and didn't dismiss his words because they had heard the name Janine Jones before. They had witness statements claiming that Janine Jones had approached them to obtain drugs that, in their opinion, were used to kill Max. However, in the state of Florida, if a doctor signs a death certificate stating that the death occurred due to natural causes, an autopsy cannot be performed. Not to mention that the quick cremation of the body deprived the police of any evidence. Officially, Max Jones died of a heart attack. As prophetically stated by Janine herself, if there's no body, you can't prove anything. Unfortunately, she was right about that. Nevertheless, Max's loved ones believe that it is right for her to spend the rest of her life in prison. During Janine's sentencing, John Chamberlain sat next to Max's father. When the judge rendered her decision and said that Janine would never be released, Max's father turned to John, placed his hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for achieving justice for my boy." Christie Maro woke up from a sudden phone call. The girl was sleeping in her room. It was 10 a.m. on Tuesday, September 6, 2011, and the 18-year-old student from the University of Technology in Auckland, New Zealand, didn't need to get up early. The phone stopped ringing before Christie picked up the receiver. But then, a few seconds later, it rang again. The girl answered. A male voice on the other end of the line asked to speak to Christie. "This is Christie," the girl said. It turned out that the caller was her acquaintance, Akshay-chan. Until recently, they both worked at a local supermarket. They weren't friends, but they sometimes talked at work and outside of it, exchanging messages on Facebook. They lived just a few blocks apart, and Akshay had come to Christie's house a few times. He often needed someone to talk to about his personal problems. Kind and compassionate, Christie was always ready to listen to him. The girl knew that Akshay had been going through a tough time lately, but she couldn't imagine what he would say next. Her heart sank when he uttered, "I dissolved 40 tablets in a drink, and if you don't come to my house within 10 minutes, I will drink it." Without a second thought, the girl hurried to help Akshay. Christie was in such a rush after Akshay's call that she had hardly any time to get dressed. She quickly put on sweatpants and a sweater over her sleepwear, grabbed her keys and mobile phone, jumped into her car, and drove about a kilometer to Akshay's house. It was unusual for Christie to ignore a cry for help. She always tried to assist those who had a harder time in life. Unlike the sociable Christie, Akshay-chan didn't have many friends. Everyone recognized his extraordinary intellect, but he found it difficult to communicate with other kids, especially girls. When fate brought them together at work in a local supermarket, Akshay began sharing his inner struggles with her. The girl sympathized with him, but in June 2011, she started a new job and saw Akshay much less frequently. By the time he called her on September 6th, a considerable amount of time had passed since their last meeting. Christie had only 2 minutes to arrive at the apartment building where the guy lived with his mother and younger sister. She parked her car, rushed up the stairs, and knocked on the door. Akshay let her inside. Christie followed him through the entrance door, which he locked behind them. There was no one else at home. Akshay's mother was at work and his 16-year-old sister was at school. As Christie sat down in a chair opposite him, she noticed a small amount of white powder on the table. It looked like someone had crushed tablets. Obviously, Chand hadn't lied when he mentioned the glass with the medication. Christie asked him where the drink was. "Do you think I'm that stupid?" He replied, "Of course, I hid it because I knew you would find it." Concerned, the girl tried to persuade Akshay to seek professional help. Her words disappointed him. From his perspective, Christie wasn't helping him cope with depression after she left the supermarket. Christie explained that she was torn between her university studies and her new job. But Chand argued that she could spare 5 minutes to chat with him on Facebook, and that would be enough. Then he added, "Let's face it, you weren't that busy." Christie became increasingly uneasy. The more he blamed her, the more she explained that she couldn't help him. He needed to reach out to a specialist. This angered Akshay even more. He jumped out of his chair and reached into his pocket for a kitchen knife. The knife was long and very sharp. Akshay held onto the handle tightly, brandishing it in front of Christie. "This is how we're going to do it," he said. "If you scream, I'll stab you with the knife." Christie began whimpering in response, prompting Chand to order her to be quiet and calm down. The girl still held onto her mobile phone, contemplating how to send a message to her friend asking for help. But Chand noticed the phone and demanded that she hand it over. Christie clung to her phone tightly, as if it were her only connection to the outside world. Failing to forcefully take the phone from her, Chand threatened the girl again, implying he would resort to using the weapon. He snatched the girl's mobile phone, and suddenly, Chand began to talk. He declared that he had big plans for the day. He decided to scare the girl, seek revenge on her for not supporting him during his most difficult period, and finally put an end to everything in one fell swoop. Then he demanded that Christie take off her sweater and hand it over to him. After searching through it, he demanded her blue top. The girl refused, but predictably, the guy threatened her with the knife. Christie complied. Then he ordered her to stand up and show that she wasn't hiding anything in her pants. She emptied her pockets, but it wasn't enough for him, and he wanted her to remove the sweatpants she was wearing. Christie refused and broke down in even greater tears. But realizing that she had no choice, she undressed, leaving herself only in her underwear. Chand crumpled her clothes into a pile, sat back in the chair, and began rambling about various things. He spouted nonsense about how people like Christie make others suffer. He accused her of coming to him only when it was already too late. Overall, more time had passed since Christie arrived at his place. Terrified, she asked if he planned to kill her. Chand reminded her of his plans for the day, to frighten her, seek revenge, and drink the prepared drink. He hadn't previously specified how he planned to seek revenge, but now he was ready to tell her. Akshay Chand wanted to violate Christie. Upon hearing this, the girl burst into tears, which prompted Chand to ask her to calm down. Then, out of the blue, he changed his mind. He returned Christie's clothes, phone, and told her she could leave. Still overwhelmed with fear, Christie initially didn't believe the sudden change in the guy's mood. What if he planned to stab her in the back, catching her off guard when she turned away? She shared her concerns with Chand, forcing him to lower the knife. "I'm letting you go, but you should know that as soon as you leave, I will drink the concoction," he said. Christie once again tried to persuade him to abandon this plan. Despite what he had put her through, her character didn't allow her to leave after such words. But Chand insisted. Too frightened to linger any longer, Christie turned around and ran out of the apartment. She hurried down the stairs to her car. Passers-by walked by, unaware of what had just happened to her. Christie wanted to ask one of them for help but she realized she wouldn't feel safe until she reached home. Getting into her car, Christie locked the doors, started the engine, and drove home. From the perspective of Christie's parents, Brian and Tracy Marceau, she was their little miracle. After the birth of their first child, a girl named Heather, Tracy and Brian Marceau had been trying to become parents again. However, it took 6 years before Christie was born. By 2011, the very close-knit family members were living far apart. Heather had moved out of the family home a few years ago, and Brian was working in Australia. Tracy was planning to move to Australia soon to be closer to her husband. Christie was also looking forward to the move. As her first year at the University of Auckland's School of Hospitality and Tourism approached its end, where she was studying event management, she could continue her education in Australia. By the age of 30, the young woman dreamed of starting her own event planning company. Currently, she still lived in her parents' home, where she grew up in the suburb of Hillcrest. On the morning of the attack on Christie, Tracy was at work when her phone rang around 11:30 a.m. It was her mother, Shirley, who lived together with Tracy and Christie in the same house. Tracy answered, and in the background, she heard Christie's hysterical crying. Then she heard her mother's voice, telling her to come home immediately because Christie had been attacked. Tracy arrived home within 15 minutes. Upon seeing her mother, Christie threw herself into her arms and didn't want to let go. Trembling and crying incessantly, she recounted what Akshay Chand had done to her. Tracy hardly knew Akshay, but she remembered that once, while seeing off Brian at the airport, they returned home with their daughter and found him waiting at the doorstep. Akshay and Christie chatted briefly. Christie assured her mother that she just needed someone to talk to, but Tracy didn't like him right away. He evoked a strange feeling in her, and she asked her daughter to stop communicating with him. However, the girl was confident that there was nothing to worry about, and Tracy had never heard of Akshay again until this incident. Shocked by the details of what had happened, Tracy immediately took her daughter to the police station. In the police station, Christie repeated her account of the attack. She didn't know why Akshay had a change of heart and let her go, but she was certain that it wasn't the end and that he would attack her again because he had been stalking her for some time. She didn't tell her parents that she had found him sitting on the steps of her house on more than one occasion. At one point, he left a note for her in the mailbox, confessing his love and thanking her for the support she had provided, which he desperately needed. Chand also insisted that Christie accept a large sum of money as a gift. She took the money but didn't spend it, believing that he would demand it back. And indeed, a few days later, he did. When she left work at the supermarket, Chand quit his job on the same day, stating that he had no reason to stay there without her. After that, their communication ceased, and it became evident that Akshay had built up a lot of anger towards Christie, believing that she had abandoned him. The thought of him being out there frightened her, and the police recognized the danger she faced. As a result, Akshay Chand was promptly placed under arrest. Akshay admitted to everything and stated that the drink he threatened to consume contained multivitamins. However, he genuinely believed that consuming them in large quantities was toxic. In the police station, he calmly explained that his motive was revenge. Chand was angry at Christie because she didn't help him with his depression, and he openly expressed that he still harbored thoughts of vengeance. The police were extremely concerned about his behavior. It was a significant leap from someone who had never had any issues with the law to a criminal charged with abduction, attempted sexual assault, and threats of harm. Since he was still angry at Christie, the detectives knew it was crucial to keep Chand in custody until he could appear in court. They prepared a document outlining the reasons why Chand should not be released on bail, emphasizing Christie's fear and the proximity of their homes. They highlighted the fact that he could appear at her doorstep within minutes if he desired. 3 days after the attack, Akshay appeared in court. His lawyer argued that her client should be released on bail because he was only 18 years old. According to the law at that time, Individuals over 17 but under 20 years old were typically eligible for bail if they had no prior convictions. Since Chand had never been arrested before, his lawyer claimed that he should be granted bail. She promised that he would take antidepressant medication and if released on bail, his family would supervise him. However, the judge believed that it was not appropriate to release a person who had shown unwavering determination to carry out his actions. Despite the law, the judge stated that the only circumstance in which she would consider granting bail was if Chand agreed to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. However, this option was unlikely. Therefore, the judge decided to defer the bail decision and requested a psychiatric evaluation for Akshay. Throughout this time, Christie continued to suffer. Her father was scheduled to return from Australia in a week, and she convinced her family not to inform him about what had happened so that he could continue working without worry. Initially, she was afraid not only to travel in public transportation but even to sleep in her own room. Whenever she heard any sound at night, she immediately asked her family to check what it was. Her greatest fear was that Akshay would be released and would attack her family or fixate on another innocent girl. By early November, life began to slowly improve. Chand was scheduled to appear in court on Wednesday, November 9th, and in 2 months, Christie and her family would be living in Australia. The relocation, which was initially meant to mark the beginning of an exciting new chapter in their lives, now became an urgent necessity. On the morning of November 7th, Tracy got up at 6:30 and began preparing for her workday. She let the dogs out, made breakfast, and took a shower. As she was getting dressed, she heard a knock on the door. It was still early, around 7 a.m., but Tracy wasn't surprised by the knock. Christie loved shopping online, and her orders were usually delivered in the morning. While Christie was still asleep, getting some rest before her late shift at work, Tracy went to answer the door herself. There was a young man standing on the porch. Tracy didn't recognize him immediately, but then she realized it was Akshay Chanda. He was holding a knife. Tracy felt fear grip her as Chanda forced his way into her home. She screamed as loudly as she could, hoping that Christie would hear and understand that something terrible was happening and have time to escape. Or maybe the neighbors would hear and come to their aid. Still threatening Tracy with the knife, Chanda asked who else was in the house. Tracy lied and said her husband was home. That was not true. He had already returned to Australia. He had wanted to leave work, but the police convinced him that his family would be safe. But somehow Chanda seemed to know this, which made Tracy suspect he had been watching them for some time. Suddenly, Christie appeared on the stairs near Tracy and Chanda. Barefoot and in her sleepwear, she was awakened by her mother's scream and went upstairs to find out what was happening. When she saw Chanda, Christie screamed. Frozen with fear, she stood at the top of the stairs, unable to move. Chanda continued to direct the knife at Tracy, slowly advancing toward Christie. Then he kicked her in the chest, causing her to tumble down the stairs. Christie got up, ran down the steps, but slipped in her haste and fell again. She then got up and ran through her grandmother's room and into the backyard. Chanda chased after her. Meanwhile, Tracy called the police. Given what Chanda had done previously, she thought he might be trying to scare Christie again. She was confident that Christie would be able to lock herself in her grandmother's room, and Chanda wouldn't be able to reach her. The police were aware of the situation. They would be there within a few minutes and arrest Chanda. Tracy dialed emergency services. But before she could provide her address, she heard a frantic scream. It was Christie. Tracy dropped the phone and ran downstairs. Christie lay on the porch in the backyard, with a pool of blood spreading beneath her. Chanda stood nearby. Tracy rushed to her daughter and embraced her. She couldn't see any wounds, but Christie couldn't move. It seemed difficult for her to breathe. Tracy repeatedly told her daughter that she loved her and begged her to hold on because help was on the way. It seemed to Tracy that Christie was trying to say something to her. Looking into her eyes, Tracy saw that life had just left them. Christie was gone. Chanda just stood there. When Tracy looked at him, she saw that he still held the knife. The blade was bent at a 90-degree angle. Chanda himself was covered in blood. Showing no concern about what might happen to her next, Tracy screamed that he had killed Christie. With a completely emotionless voice, he replied, "I'm glad." The police arrived less than 10 minutes after the attack began. Chanda was still in the backyard, listening to music on an iPad. The broken knife lay on the ground. An officer asked what he was doing there. Chanda replied, "Retribution." Another officer noticed that Chanda's hands were trembling and asked why. He responded, "It's not easy to kill someone, is it?" Chanda was arrested and taken to the police station. Tracy had the difficult task of informing Heather and Brian about what had just happened to Christie. The Marceau family had been convinced that something like this would happen ever since Chanda was released on bail a month earlier. Initially, the judge denied his release, citing the need for further information about the case and the defendant's health condition. However, since he qualified for bail under the law, his lawyer quickly filed 2 applications for release. Chanda wrote a letter to the new judge, David McNaughton, expressing remorse for the attack on Christie. He stated that he deeply regretted what he had put the girl through and, given the opportunity, he would apologize to her and her family. Christie also wrote a letter to the judge, pleading not to release Akshay. She believed that since he had nothing to lose, he would attempt to attack her again. On October 5th, the judge granted Chanda bail, despite reading Christie's letter and being aware that the police also believed it was right to keep him behind bars. Chanda was allowed to return to his home, which was located just 350 meters away from Christie's house, in a straight line. The police were extremely disappointed but assured the Marceau family that they would protect them. Officers promised to check on Chanda at various times of the day, making sure he was at home. All the officers patrolling the area were informed about the case. Overall, the police visited Chanda 23 times in the 32 days he was free, and each time he was at home. Despite the police assurances, Christie's fears grew. And after 32 days, he showed up at her doorstep with a knife. Forensic experts investigating the scene of her death found the knife Chanda used to stab her 10 to 15 times before it bent 90 degrees and became useless. He attacked her from behind, delivering a powerful blow to the back of her head. She fell to the floor, where Chanda continued to strike her on the back. One wound was so severe that Christie almost felt nothing afterwards. In the police station, Chanda was surprisingly calm and immediately confessed to everything. Despite suddenly releasing Christie on one occasion, he had never let go of his desire for revenge, and in prison, he started plotting her murder. Knowing that he needed to escape from prison to carry out his plan, he feigned remorse by writing a sympathetic letter to the judge. While free, he didn't waste any time and waited, knowing that Christie and her family would be protected by the police. Although the judge believed that Chanda's family would keep an eye on him throughout the day, his mother worked long hours, and his sister was too young for such a role. She was scared of him herself. All his mother could do was keep kitchen knives away from him, but Chanda knew what she had in mind and hid one of them. On November 7th, he woke up at 6:30, knowing that the day had come. In 2 days, he was scheduled to appear in court, and Christie probably believed that she was safe. The investigators were confident that Akshay would be found guilty on all charges, since he had confessed to everything. However, they were surprised when he decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Several experts, including one hired by his defense and 2 from the prosecution, evaluated him. Akshay told them that he had been hearing a persistent female voice for some time, especially in the mornings. He claimed that the voice ordered him to kill Christie and wished for her mother's death. Although initially Akshay could resist the voice's influence, he eventually succumbed to it. After consultations with psychiatrists and starting medication, he didn't express remorse for the murder but acknowledged that he would have to live with the knowledge of what he had done. It was incredibly difficult for Christie's parents to come to terms with the medical assessment. Tracy, in particular, struggled. She regretted opening the door to the killer and couldn't forget the last moments of Christie's life. "All I see, all I will ever see, is my daughter lying on my lap, gasping for air, covered in blood, dying for some senseless reason. He just stood there and watched. He didn't even attempt to escape. What kind of person does that?" She demanded punishment for Akshay, but the psychiatrist explained to her that Akshay's symptoms, previously attributed to depression, could now be explained by schizophrenia. Moreover, when depression is treated with medication, symptoms of schizophrenia can become more pronounced. During the first attack, the illness was in its early stage, and he managed to understand that harming the girl would be wrong, so he let her go. However, during the second incident, when he came for her, he was aware of what he was doing, but his illness prevented him from understanding that it was morally unacceptable. Akshay couldn't be tried for murder, but he was found guilty of kidnapping and attempted sexual assault. However, he would still serve his punishment in a psychiatric facility. He would only be released if he ceased to pose a danger to society, but his chances of recovery were extremely slim. The Marceau family relocated to Adelaide, Australia, but they didn't allow Christie's murder to become just another crime statistic. If Akshay had not been released on bail after the first crime, Christie would have moved to Australia and lived happily. Therefore, they started a campaign to change the bail laws. Thanks in part to their efforts, since 2013, defendants are required to prove that they are not a threat to society, instead of the police having to prove the opposite as it was before.